Dany's heart was heavy as she nodded firmly to the Maester and the Red Priest at his side. It had been decided that, without combat having begun, they would leave Rorigal where he was. To sound the horn now might contradict the orders of the Dragon Riders, and they were all too well aware of the need to look coordinated. Best foot forward. It took but a spoken command in Drogon's ear to cause the dragon to push off gracefully from the ground. With a flap of the animal's broad wings they were suddenly high above the Godswood, the cityscape appearing before her in dramatic fashion as the trees fell away and the stone edifice of the Red Keep filling her vision. Drogon fully unfurled his wings, and with one mighty heave he flew through the air, shooting past the red towers of the keep and gliding over the city. She could see people far below look up and point as the dragon, this creature of legend, appeared in the sky above them. A cry of exultation reached her ears. She didn't have to turn to know that Aegon was just behind her, enjoying the graceful flight of traveling on Viserian's back. He better enjoy it while he can. There may be precious little enjoyment for the rest of the day. Dany herself refused to relax and enjoy the sensation of flying as Drogon looped high above the city. The creature roared happily as glided its way across the city, covering the distance from the Godswood of the Red Keep to the outer walls of the city within moments. She urged the creature higher and higher so that it soared into plain view of the army assembling across the way. Drogon quickly extended his wings to their full capacity, letting out another billowing roar. That should show them what they are fighting. At the Queen's command the dragon dropped quickly and landed deftly on the Old Gate, the middle of the city's 3 northern gates. A wide enough space had been cleared so that she and Aegon could land without incident or obstruction. It wouldn't do to have a dramatic landing be interrupted by something getting in the way. She surveyed the platform she had landed on. It was a wide stone expanse that covered the entire area of the gate below. Archers from the city watch were posted at intervals along the crenulations. Boiling pitch stood waiting in large metal pots standing on fires. A heavy sound told her that Aegon had landed and was moving Viserion alongside her and Drogon. A sobering sight, her nephew declared as his eyes swept over the array of armed men less than a league from the city. He wasn't wrong. Dany took in the vast army that Robb Stark has assembled before them. During her flights over the lands she had seen the extent of the Stark camp assembled about halfway between King's Landing and Antlers. It was an arresting sight to see that the enemy camp had now emptied itself to put tens of thousands of men before her. All drawn up in battle formation. Her heartbeat increased. So many. Aegon seemed to sense her unease. There is no need for concern. His voice echoed menacingly inside the metal of his helm. We have a hardened army with us. The city is fully defended. And we have 3 dragons. Can he really be that at ease with our situation? Dany's mind flashed back to the advice given her by Barristan Selmy and Jorah Mormont. True, she had an army, but one that was made up of many factions and had not yet fought together as a cohesive force. She had a city, but one that was a burnt-out shell of its previous glory, with people who were weary and exhausted with fighting a crippling fire. Finally she had dragons, but they were still relatively young and untested in combat. I would not be quite so confident of victory if I were you, nephew. One furtive look confirmed that her nephew was thinking the same thing. For all his bravado, the king's eyes were tight, his eyes restless. Sat so close to her nephew, Dany could see that beads of sweat that had appeared on his face and were trickling past his nose inside his helmet. No, he is not as confident as he would have me believe. She nodded firmly as if agreeing with her betrothed. It is time we make clear to the young wolf that we are unimpressed by his show of force. The Queen turned to a soldier who stood waiting in an alcove set into the stonework of Gatehouse. At her command the man came forward and walked briskly to the city walls. He grabbed a flagpole onto which was attached a large piece of black fabric. He adjusted his position before hoisting the pole aloft and waving the flag to the ranks of men arrayed in front of them. Robb too. Watching the Targaryen army march out to the east and west had a hypnotic effect, as if the steady rhythmic beat of hundreds of booted steps could dull the mind into a stupor. Thankfully the anxiousness that coursed through his veins was enough to ward off any desire to sleep. He saw, dead ahead, that a flag was being waved into the air above the center gate of the city wall. The black flag was fully unfurled and the figure on the wall was waving it determinedly at the Targaryen army. Suddenly he saw 3 figures spur their mounts and head towards the rise his army was currently occupying. He watched as the riders got closer, making short work of the distance. One raised a white flag that had been tied to a spear and held aloft as they got closer with every passing second. Rob let out a breath. A parley then. Maybe we can avoid a battle after all. His head tilted to one side. Brian. Your Grace. The warrior woman's voice was tense. I would listen to what they have to say. There was a slight pause. You mean to have them brought to you, Your Grace? Nice try, Brian. No, I mean to ride down. Your Grace, I must pro. The king waved a hand. So noted. Come with me if you are concerned for my safety. You and Clegane both. Just the two of us, Your Grace. Brian's face was full of concern. The two of you fought your way through the Faith of the Seven. I dare say that we can handle whatever these three men have to throw at us. He paused. Plus, we'll have grey wine to keep us safe. At the sound of his name, the large direwolf looked up at his master expectantly. The large soulful eyes caught Rob's and the creature's tongue hung out eagerly. Chuckling, Rob gathered the reins of his horse. With a determined kick he spurred his mount down the gentle rise and towards the incoming riders. He made sure that his horse maintained a steady pace as he closed the distance. He wanted to get this over with but didn't want to appear rushed or phased by the other group's approach. Behind him he heard the noise of hooves striking soft ground. He knew that a few of his men were following. He hoped that Brian had followed his orders. It would look ridiculous if a host of armed men followed him to a meeting with such a small party. The other riders had come to a stop. He pulled on his reins as they got closer and his horse halted mere sword lengths from their enemy. Rob recognized Grey Worm instantly, though the central figure of Sir Barristan Selmy took prominence. The man was resplendent in white armor, the paleness of which matched the white of his bear. To the other side of the fabled knight was a figure that Rob did know nor recognize, though the gold bands around his arms marked him as member of the Golden Company. Sirs, Rob said respectfully. Sir Barristan stilled his skittish mount, leaning down and patting the horse's flank. Good day to you, my lord. We would know the meaning of your presence here. Lord, not king. Rob smiled thinly. He made a quick decision not to acknowledge the fact that the man had not called him by his title. You and your king and queen are well aware of the reasons for my gathering my army. I have sent your leaders terms. I would have an answer to them. The answer is no, boy. The sellsword spat. The king does not yield to threats from people. Especially those he thought to be allies. The king's eyes flashed, and I did not think to have had my family attacked by a faction I thought to be my friends. Queen Daenerys and King Aegon had nothing to do with the outrage perpetuated against your family, sir. Sir Barristan declared quickly. Nothing whatsoever. Rob's eyes were cold as they took in the night before him. I wish I could believe that, sir. But the leader of the assassins was a captain of the Golden Company. He looked towards the sellsword, King Aegon's veteran troops. He stole into the camp with a group of sellswords and tried to murder my wife and child. Rob's face tightened. That is something that requires some explaining. His Grace does not explain himself to vassals. The sellsword hurled back. We have stated that we had nothing to do with the attack. Your presence here is insulting, your tone provocative. You best take my advice and leave. The young wolf regarded the man coolly. The sellsword was so thin and skeletal he might have been a corpse. The only color on the man's head from his pointed black beard and blood-red hair. He had the skin of some exotic eastern creature draped across one shoulder. Greywind suddenly growled menacingly. The sellsword's eyes flicked, but he did not back down from the beast, though he struggled to keep his horse in position. Rob looked to the center of the small group once more. Sir Barristan was barely containing a grimace as he met Rob's gaze. He offered an apologetic smile. I ask you to forgive my colleague. He was instructed to be firm in stating our position. The knight gave the sellsword a warning look. It would seem that he took that instruction rather zealously to heart. The sellsword glowered but nodded his head to Sir Barristan, silently acknowledging the other man's command of the situation. Satisfied, the knight turned back to Rob. The Queen wished to convey her shock and disgust at the attack on your family. She vows to conduct a proper investigation. If one of the attackers is found to have been one of our men, then they will be punished with a severity befitting the hideousness of their crime. Just as you did upon the death of Joffrey and Tommen. Rob asked archly. An investigation was conducted. The old knight blinked. Joffrey Baratheon took his own life and the boy Tommen died from a tragic fall. Well, there can be no doubt in the way that Myrcella and Circea died. Rob observed shortly, someone caused that explosion. Indeed, Sir Barristan agreed, and, now that the fire has been extinguished, a full investigation will now take place. Another investigation. Rob's kept his tone light, though his eyes narrowed. I'm sure that their graces will declare the events at the Great September to be the result of an accident as well. Grey Worm stirred from his place in the saddle. Though his body didn't move, his muffled voice came through his curiously shaped helm. My queen will do all that is needed to catch the criminals. Well, at least he concedes that there are crimes to be answered. So you see, Your Grace, Barristan continued, there is no need for threats and fighting. Queen Daenerys is willing to fully cooperate with you to find out who is responsible for the actions taken against both our parties. Does he actually believe that? Cooperate? Rob retorted, like she did when I asked for permission to cross her lands to hunt for Lord Mace Tyrell in the Stormlands. His face grew angry, like she did when I asked for leave to enter the city to help fight the fire that endangered the lives of so many of the small folk. He slowly shook his head. I'm afraid, Sir Barristan, that I have seen how much the Targaryens' cooperation is worth. He gave a dry laugh. Nothing at all, it seems to me. Do not dare insult my queen, Grey Worm said firmly. The Mother of Dragons is a great ruler. Rob ignored the man. He looked again at Selmy. Sir Barristan, am I to take it that your king and queen refuse my terms? Barristan Selmy looked desperately uncomfortable. My lord, you sat with King Aegon and Queen Daenerys several moon turns ago. You agreed, gave your word of honor, that peace would exist between our two factions. I did, Rob said coldly, but there were terms for such an agreement. One of which was the safe conduct of Cersei Lannister's children. All three have since died in, let us be charitable, suspicious circumstances. Their deaths were tragic. Sir Barristan carried on persistently, but even if what you say is true, that the boys were murdered, then I repeat that the king and queen were not responsible. My queen would never be involved in the deaths of children, Grey Worm hissed, reiterating Selmy's point. Rob shook his head. I would be more inclined to believe your ruler if it weren't for Lysa Omer's presence in my tent equipped with poison to kill my wife and son. Selmy looked uncertain. The sellsword spoke for the group. How do we even know he was there? Rob's eyes narrowed to mere slits. You doubt my word? Your word? The skeletal man barked mockingly. We have seen how much that counts for Gorys. Barristan Selmy said sharply, his tone harsh. This is not the time or place for insults. They insult us. The name called, Gorys complained. They advance on the king's lands with threats of steel and bloodshed, based on half-truths and trumped-up charges. The man gestured at Rob and his party. This is a mummer's farce and, worse, it is not even an entertaining one. Selmy shot the man an angry look before turning back to Rob. I apologize, my. Enough of this. The king raised his hand. Sir Barristan, we could talk all day about guilty parties and accuse each other until the moon turns. It is time to end this. I ask one last time, will the Targaryens lay down their arms? The aged knight sat rigidly in the saddle. Behind him, Grey Worm remained at attention, a silent sentinel whose closed helm betrayed none of his inner feelings. Gorys the sellsword just sat languidly on top of his own horse, saying nothing beyond offering a half-smirk at Rob. Finally Selmy spoke. I regret, my lord, that King Aegon and Queen Daenerys reject your terms. They feel themselves unjustly accused and threatened by your words and actions. They will not surrender to you. Then we have come to the end of this charade. The young wolf nodded silently. Inwardly he prayed that he was doing the right thing. Then we must consider this parley at an end, Sir Barristan. He started to wheel his horse around when the knight spoke once more. This is a mistake, my lord. A terrible mistake. I am inclined to agree, but there we are. The king turned back to the man. What would you have me do, Sir Barristan? Talk some more, my lord. What harm can be done by talking? We have been talking for months, Sir Rob said curtly, and while we talk peace, people have died. And yet more still could have died if it were not for dumb luck. Very well, my lord, Barristan said, as his horse trotted forward, then let us decide this like men of honor, so that no more need die. The king turned his mount to face the man. What do you suggest, sir? The knight took a breath. It seems to me that, with both you and my queen and king unable to agree to end this deadlock, that a battle must be fought to decide matters.
So it would seem.
Robb allowed cautiously. Then why not settle this now? Sabaristan declared. Why not decide this by trial by combat? You and I here. Now. What are you doing, you fool? The sellsword behind Baristan exclaimed. Trying to save lives. The old knight's gaze did not waver. If it comes to a battle, then thousands will die. I propose that only one death is needed to end this. He looked at Robb unflinchingly. You believe that my masters are guilty of great crimes. You demand justice of them. I tell you that they are innocent and still desire an alliance between our two sides. Let us have a trial by combat and let the gods decide who is right. An alliance would be most unlikely were you to kill me, Robb observed. But then I suppose the Targaryens' problems would be at an end. At least until father arrived from the north. Then allow a champion to fight in your stead, Baristan replied. I fight my own battles, Robb retorted. He sighed heavily. He felt the urge to indulge in honorable combat well within him. Not so unlike the sensation of when Jaime Lannister had proposed the same thing after the Whispering Wood. And like then, I must decline. If we do it your way, Sabaristan, you might win. If that happened, then the entire future of my kingdom would be thrown into doubt. I cannot risk such an outcome on the swing of a single sword. As much as I may want to. I expected more from the son of Eddard Stark, Sabaristan making no effort to hide his surprise. Have you no honor, sir? Robb suppressed the anger boiling within him. What honor would there be in abandoning my people to rule under the Targaryens? They have proved themselves unable to rule a city, much less 7 kingdoms. I would not leave an errant dog to the tender mercies of the dragon's insanity, much less the people who have sworn an oath to me. The Targaryens are a blight on the land, they must be removed. Grey Worm stirred. The mother of dragons is. The mother of dragons is a girl playing at being a queen, Robb snarled angrily. He looked at the old knight. And I will not take lessons in honor from a man who would stand by and let madness take the throne. The young wolf tilted his head, though perhaps I shouldn't be surprised. You sat idle, sir, while the Mad King burned people alive. The great Sabaristan Selmy, who once asked mercy from Aes for House Hollard's children as the only boon for rescuing the king from the depth of Duskendale cells, now making excuses for a family of murderers. Robb's mouth twisted cruelly. How the mighty have fallen. Sabaristan Selmy flushed. He struggled to meet Robb's eye, but, eventually, he managed it. My lord, if it comes to battle, the gods themselves will rue this day. Don't I know it? Maybe, Sabaristan. Urge your queen to stand down and she and her nephew can go into peaceful exile. They are no longer welcome in Westeros. You dare? Gorys started. Yes. I dare. Robb Stark stated coldly. Your faction lost my goodwill when you tried to kill my family. Surrender and spare your people. We will not. Gorys hurled back. He waved an arm towards the city. You attack the city, Stark, and you're a dead man. You and your entire army. Do you forget that we have the walls and dragons to defend them? Come at us and my king. It will avail you nothing except to receive the promises of House Targaryen. Fire and blood. Then this discussion is at an end, Robb said soberly, but, when you do see your rulers again, remind them of the warning we Starks live by. Winter is coming. Dany too. She watched from her place on the old gate as the parley broke apart. She saw Baristan Selmy and Grey Worm ride hard back towards the city gates. The third member of the group, Gorys Adrian, rode to the southwest to link up with Lord Jon Connington. As her 2 faithful men got close, Dany ruminated on the decision to send them out to meet with the Starks in the first place. It should have been me who went. She muttered quietly. Sir Baristan is a man of war, Aegon stated firmly. If the Stark boy is to take us seriously, then he must be made to recognize that we have many fine warriors among us. Dany shook her head. That's only half the truth. Perhaps not even that. Aegon had insisted that he and the Lord hand-pick the members of the treaty party. She suspected that they hadn't wanted to endanger her and anyone of crucial importance in case the Starks broke faith and killed the envoys. His paranoia will be the death of all of us. Say what you want of Robb Stark, but he is not an oath-breaker. Varys has the right of it. He believes we are responsible for attacking his family. Under such circumstances would I not do as he is doing now. Still she trusted Sabaristan implicitly, she prayed that he had been able to convince the young wolf of their innocence. The signs, however, did not look good. As soon as Robb Stark and his party returned to the enemy's lines, a horn blast went up. On the horizon Dany could discern small vague shapes that flew away from the camp. Ravens. Dark wings, dark words. Below the old gate the ranks of men parted to let Barristan ride through. Grey Worm veered off and headed towards the ranks of Unsullied where, Dany, knew he would surrender his horse and join his infantry on the ground. At a command from Ser Jorah the city gates were opened and Selmy rode hard through the large entrance and into the streets beyond. Dany knew it would be a few minutes before Ser Barristan was able to climb the steps to join them at the top of the gate to report on the parley. She returned her gaze to the Stark army. She had to admit it was an impressive sight. Thousands and thousands of masked men spread out in all directions. They were some distance away, but there were a great many of them. More than we have here. I pray Maester Marwyn's Raven got through to Victorian and Mossador. We could do with the additional men. Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Ser Jorah and Ser Barristan. Both looked grim as they came to stand before Dany and Aegon. They bowed formally. Well? Aegon asked impatiently. Ser Barristan's face was full of shame. I regret, your grace, that Robb Stark has refused to relent. He refused to accept our protest that we were not involved in the recent death of the Lannisters nor with the attack on his own camp. He repeated his terms that we stand down and open the city to him. Impudence. Aegon seethed. Dany heard him shift in the makeshift saddle that was buckled to Viserian's white gold hide. Did I not tell you that the man won't listen to reason? That this is all just a pretense to attack us and drive us from the land? Dany did not bother to reply. She looked out again at the massive army before them. Can we beat such a force? Has Gorys gone to inform Connington? Aegon asked, irritated by his aunt's silence. Viserion, sensing his master's frustration, began to move uneasily beneath him. He has, your grace, Selmy reported formally. Grey Worm has also gone to resume command of the Unsullied. We should send another envoy, Mormont said quickly. Convince Stark that we need to talk this through. Afraid to die, Mormont? Aegon said mockingly with a measure of contempt. At Dany's questioning look, Ser Jorah blushed. We need to investigate Stark's claims properly. Pa. Aegon spat, we'll have plenty of time to do that later. In case it had escaped your notice, we're likely to be under attack at any moment. Discovering what Lysa Omar was up to can wait for another day. Jorah Mormont's face was expressionless. Personally, your grace, I would rather know the truth of the matter before a battle begins. I have no objection to fighting in your service, but I have deep objection to my fighting and dying to serve another person's agenda. I doubt Robb Stark will give us the time to look into this now. Do you truly believe Stark would attack us? Dany asked intently. Her mind rebelled at the idea. I thought he was my friend. He is a young man who fears for his family, Barristan replied. Who knows what he might do? As if in answer, another klaxon of horns went up from the Stark host. As one, the massed ranks began to move forward towards the city. Dany was momentarily paralyzed by the vision of disciplined men marching in formation towards them. Never before had she seen such a sight. Always before it had been she who had the host of trained soldiers who were ready to do battle with run-down garrisons and slave masters. Not once during her time in Essos had she had to command a pitched battle. That's your answer? Aegon said, gripping the Viserian's reins tightly. Robb Stark is heading this way. Only strength of arms will stop him now. Dany lowered her head. Gods help me. Her head came up, then strength of arms is what we'll meet him with. She turned her head. Send the signal. Flag bearers suddenly thronged the battlements, waving red flags to the north and south, alerting the waiting troops that battle was at hand. As soon as they were seen, large war horns were blown. The sound was deafening. Drogon hissed in confusion as his ears were assaulted by the cacophony of noise and activity around him. Barristan, Mormont, to your positions, I suspect your men have need of you. Aegon Part stood in his saddle. Stand firm all of you, he cried, we shall soon send this mangy pup back to the frigid hellhole he calls the north. Some of the soldiers on the ramparts let out a cheer. Together, Dany's knights took their leave, heading to their men. With one last glance at her, Egon shouted an order to Viserion, and the dragon launched itself into the sky, gliding towards the south. And battle. Connington I. The hand of the king sat on his charger to the southwest of the Gate of the Gods. The massed ranks of the Golden Company were drawn up in their various formations to either side of the Storm Lord. The experienced sellswords were standing in their ranks at loose attention, waiting for commands to be issued. He has split the company into 6 distinct groups that all had their individuals' captains and orders. Further to the southwest, Connington could see the Dornish host. The 2 divisions of southern warriors had been arrayed between the Golden Company and the Blackwater Rush, utilizing a wide bend in the river to protect their western flank from the enemy. Connington knew that Oberyn Martell would be in command of the group furthest from the city. The Red Viper knew that it was likely to be here that the enemy would strike, aiming to try and turn the Dornish flank. The prince had assured Connington that that would not happen. I believe him. In between the Golden Company and the main Dornish host was a small host of reserves, supported by one of the company's squads. The 2 units were there to offer a tempting target to the foe, in the hope that they would charge the center and be enveloped by the wings of Connington's host. In fact, the Lord of Griffin's Roost had prepared many such traps across the battlefield. John Connington's mind went back almost 20 years before to the Battle of the Bells. My greatest failure, a harbinger of everything that came later. My loss of name and titles, my exile, the loss of Rhaegar, everything came from that moment, when I was beaten by that drunken sot Robert Baratheon. A feeling of wistfulness shot through him. It was not just. I fought hard. I killed many men that day, damn near killed Hoster Tully in honorable combat. Would that I had found the usurper. I would have dearly loved for him to face my steel. Instead, the coward hid, only showing himself when his reinforcements arrived to save his miserable skin. I retreated in good order, but the damage was done. The usurper lived to fight another day. Connington's throat tightened. Lived, to face my Silver Prince at the Ruby Ford and smite him with his warhammer. The man who should have inherited Aerys' crown struck down, his beauty forever destroyed by the harsh metal of the Stormlands. His eyes went to the city where he had seen 2 dragons land somewhere along the wall. Now I serve the son of the man I failed so many years ago. If he was honest with himself. John Connington sometimes found it difficult to believe that Egon was from Rhaegar's seed. The boy was as different as one could be from Connington's former friend and master. His temperament was very different from his father. He was headstrong, willful, stubborn, but the Lord of Griffin's Roost had to believe the boy could learn and grow. True, Egon was no Rhaegar. He is too caught in the past, yet so certain of his views, of what he thinks is right. But, for all that, he comes from noble stock. Egon has the ability to be great if only circumstances would allow him to show his true potential. Gorys Adrian came riding along the line. Connington had sent him as part of the team that parleyed with the Starks. The man was careful, detail-orientated, obsessed with money, a requirement for serving as paymaster of the Golden Company, but was also known for being level-headed and able to follow instructions. An ideal man to send to negotiate with the Starks. "No use, my lord," Adrian exclaimed. He reined in his horse in front of Connington. The boy would not be intimidated. Even by the sight of our forces and our dragons on high, he was immovable. Connington shrugged. He had expected as much. A young man would unlikely be deterred from war, not when he hears the battle horns sound and gets the scent of blood in his nostrils. What else? Old Whitebeard thought to offer the boy single combat. Adrian scoffed. Fool believed he could appeal to the Stark sense of honor and end this with but a single death. An honorable action, Connington muttered quietly. The world would be a better place if there were more men like Barristan Selmy. Gorys Adrian looked quizzically at him. This one will never understand. He lives for money, and that is all he sees when dealing with others. Connington waved a hand dismissively. So Robb Stark actually means to attack us, does he? It is the only course open to him. The sellsword messenger concurred. He can hardly march his army down from their camp only to retreat because of a few threats. Would that I had been so bold at the Stony September. I might have burned the town and history might have been very different. Then we must ensure that such threats are a reality. The hand surveyed the army across the field ahead of him. There are a great many of them. Shame they are being led by a man so consumed with ambition. He addressed Adrienne, "Ride to Franklin Flowers' unit and tell him to make ready." "My lord," Goris replied before offering a salute and galloping away. Connington gestured to a group of waiting hornblowers, "Battle positions." At almost the same time as the Golden Company sounded the call to war, the sound was met by equal noise from the city, along with accompanying signals from the army of sellswords and unsullied before the gates of King's Landing. John Connington, Lord of Griffin Roost and the Hand of the Targaryen King, watched the battlefield carefully. "I failed the father. I will not fail the son. Brian I." The horns sounded around her, a deafening cry of 100 instruments all played at once. It made her want to place her hands over her ears. Gods, what a racket! She glanced to the side. Just behind, to the right, sat the fearsome spectre of Sandor Clegane. The hound, fully armored, sat casually in the saddle of his warhorse, eagerly finishing off a large piece of chicken he had relieved from the mess tents before they had departed for King's Landing. Now, with the battle just about to start, he was savagely biting into the cooked meat, rending it between his teeth. "Shouldn't you have your helm on?" she observed dryly, nodding to the dog's head helm Clegane had tied to the saddle. "Plenty of time for that in a minute," Clegane retorted as he bit decisively down into his food once more. "Got to keep my strength up. It's hungry work, killing. Useless. If he wasn't so good in a fight, I wouldn't have him with me at all." Brian turned her head. At her other side was Daisy Mormont. The Lady of Bear Island sat, perfectly poised in her saddle, watching the armies deploying in front of her with a keen curiosity. Her mace was strapped loosely at her side, but she looked ready, alert for what may happen next, the very opposite of the hound, who seemed to have no other interest at all in proceedings save his own appetite. Brian felt a kinship with Daisy Mormont. She was, after all, the only other woman in the Wolf's Guard. Though some had raised their eyebrows at yet another woman being included, they could hardly argue that the Positon was unwritten. Daisy Mormont had served with Robb Stark since he had left Winterfell and headed south. She shook her head. "They may be very different, but I am hardly poorly served. These two are some of the best fighters in the realm." Behind Clegane were the three warriors who had come into the camp with Tyrion Lannister. Asher Forrester, the woman called Biska, and the sellsword named Bronn had all borrowed horses and armor from the stores and allowed by the king to fight alongside the Wolf Guard. Brian did not want them here. There were too many unknown factors on the field already without introducing these people. Still, the hound had vouched for Asher and Biska's skill and even voiced a grudging respect for Bronn. That had been all Robb Stark had needed to assign them to her after they expressed a desire to fight. Well, Bronn hadn't. Brian suspected that the imp had regaled the sellsword of the potential rewards of fighting for the Starks. He probably cited Clegane as an example. "The man has drunk and eaten his way through most of the camp, but seems remarkable content with his lot. And if this Bronn wants gold, then there are none richer than King Robb, what with the Reach and Westerlands under his control." She shot a wary look at the sellsword. "Still, I would be foolish to turn my back on any of them." A flag bearer near the king suddenly raised a pole that sported a brilliant green flag. Brian nodded definitively. "Time to be off." She raised a gauntleted hand. "Wolf Guard on me." A quick flick of the reins made her horse start forward. She felt, rather than heard, the sound of her 1,000-strong unit come into step and trot down the rise. To the west Brian saw Garland Tyrell order his own host forward. Some 8,000 soldiers, all mounted knights from the Reach, marched forward in parallel formation to Brian's own smaller unit. The soldiers, who looked resplendent, their armor and weapons glistened in the midday sun as they rode boldly forward. Slowly the hosts descended the rise and began to follow the king's road towards the waiting city. Connington too. The movement of the Stark center caught his eye. Up until that moment he'd been watching the Tyrell host that had spread out northwest of his position, their vast force easily matching the combined might of the Golden Company and the Dornish army. The massed ranks of green-liveried soldiers stood in tight formation, as still as statues. The Tyrells are only where they are today because of the benevolence of Aegon the Conqueror. By rights, they should be among our own army as loyal vassals to the Targaryens, not fighting alongside the barbarians from the north. He let out a short breath. They always were ambitious little bastards, and Mace Tyrell was the worst of the lot. The sudden activity from the Stark center caused him a flash of confusion. Why push forward with your center without the support of your army's wings? In open ground it might serve to create a spear point to hammer through the obstacles, but here, the obstacle was the city of King's Landing. Hardly a thing to be moved aside by cavalry. In any case, what folly would cause an experienced commander to send soldiers to attack a stone-walled city with cavalry anyway? Have they taught their horses to climb ladders during my exile in Essos? Conington snorted to himself. No, the pup may be young but he's hardly a fool. Clearly some kind of trick to draw us out. Maybe so that they can surround our disciplined Unsullied. Attacking them in the open and from behind must look tempting. He watched for a moment. No, they are ignoring the Unsullied and the city in its entirety. He smiled grimly. They want to pull apart our lines and push the company and Prince Oberyn against the Blackwater. The city can be taken later, of course. Hell, the bastards could simple starve us out, but our army has to be dealt with before a siege can take place. The cavalry in the center will try and turn us west while the Tyrell infantry marches from the north to hammer our flank. We'll be caught with the river at our backs and nowhere to run. The Lord shook his head. Really, it was all such an obvious ploy. I expected better of the legendary Robb Stark, the fabled strategist who outmaneuvered the great Tywin Lannister. In fact, now that Conington considered it, this whole battle was unnecessary from the Stark point of view. King's Landing was dependent on the food sent by the Reach. If that supply line was cut, the city would starve. What with the fire, the capital was already in a desultory state. Why not just let hunger and desperation end this? Of course, Conington had been prepared for that as well. Had Robb Stark cut the supply lines, he would have ordered a withdrawal to the Stormlands. Pointless staying in a dying city with an unruly populace. Yet, no, Robb Stark had decided to pursue a different course. He shrugged. Well, if the wolf wants to play with the dragon, so be it. Conington raised a mailed fist and signaled another flag bearer. Let us see if the young wolf is as impetuous as his name suggests. He paused but a moment to watch the signal go up to the divisions of the Golden Company that were spread between Conington's own host and the western walls of King's Landing. Twisting in his saddle, the Lord Hand beckoned to Hornbearer, who quickly raised his instrument to his bearded lips. A loud note rang out. And the Dornish and Company units at Conington's flank suddenly readied their shields and dropped their spears into position. That should hold the main Tyrell host should they get delusions of grandeur. Hold them there while we deal with their errant horsemen in the northeast. For a moment there was nothing on Conington's mind but the cavalry advancing down the King's Road toward him. Satisfied that he was ready to counter Stark's opening move, the Stormlord signaled to the hornblower again. Once more a loud note went up behind him. Moments later the city sent a responding signal. The sounds were cut off by a screeching cry from the Gate of the Gods. Without warning, Viserion suddenly stood on his hind legs, spread his wings aloft and then launched himself boldly into the sky. A glint of armor could be seen on the creature's back as the creature took to the air. The white gold dragon soared up and then banked west, flying steadily over the Gold Company, who let out a mighty cheer at the sight of the dragon supporting them from above. Conington smiled inwardly. That's my boy. As he watched the dragon circled once over the Golden Company, Egon waving formally to the troops before angling his mount towards the Dornish. Just as we planned. Now if the Tyrells attack, they'll be met not only with steel but with fire as well. Dany 3. The top of the old gate was awash with people, soldiers for the most part. Their anxious faces looking out in only one direction. Dany still sat on Drogon's back. The dragon seemed eager to be off, but she kept a tight control of him. Even then he changed position and cried out in protest at her keeping him as steady as she could. She suspected that Drogon had heard Viserion's cry and was keen to follow in his clutch mate's wake. Not yet. As Drogon ceased his fidgeting, a single low tone reached her ears. Unlike the clamor going on in the fields ahead, this sound came from behind her. The dragon horn. I'd recognize that monstrosity anywhere. Abruptly the awful tone was met by an accompanying sound. At a flash, Drogon's head wiped round in a vain attempt to look towards the noise. After a second's hesitation, Dany allowed the dragon to reorient itself. As Drogon looked up, he let another cry come forth, as if in recognition of a long-lost friend. There, set above the Red Keep, soared Rhaegal. The green creature fly high in a rotating arc as he got higher and higher, as if relishing the freedom from the earthly confines to which he had recently been in self-imposed exile. Rorigal suddenly spread his wings to their widest extent before diving towards the city, banking at the last moment and then flying low above the buildings. Dany could almost imagine the fear from the small folk below as the dragon flew above their families and homes. For once she did not care. The dragon was a sight that almost brought tears to her eyes. Clearly Mokoro and Marwyn and coaxed the creature into flight once again. It has been so long since he had flown. It has not been since the day I took Robb Stark into the Godswood. The thought sobered her. Gods, so much has changed since that day. Back then I thought we were on the verge of a grand alliance that would bring peace across the land. Now we're on the cusp of a major battle that will see thousands dead. But for all that, she couldn't dent it was good to see Rorigal in flight once again. The creature flew straight towards the old gate, unerringly following a course that led directly to her and Drogon. With a last cry of triumph the beast landed more or less directly beside Drogon. Rorigal quickly folded his wings back behind him. Drogon hissed in welcome and the two dragons affectionately snapped at one another. He looks more alive than I've ever seen him. It was true. The green dragon had a light in his eyes that seemed to shine with its intensity. No more were the signs of lethargy and depression that seemed to dog her child of late. Content, Dany returned her attention to the plains in front of King's Landing where yet more horns were sounding. As she observed, Barristan Selmy rode through the gateway to the head of the host before the city walls. He gave order to nearby messengers and horn blowers and, at a set of signals, the whole army seemed to turn as one and march to the east. The sellswords who had followed Dany since Meereen were at the eastern flank of her whole army. The companies of the Windblown, the Second Sons and the Storakraus took the lead as they marched with the Unsullied and Dothraki cavalry behind them. The sounds of thousands of men marching in unison was impressive. Dany cast an eye towards the easternmost front of the column where the tattered prince led his 1,000-strong cavalrymen away from King's Landing. Dothraki screamers thundered past them quickly as the Second Sons and Storakraus comprised the center. Daario Naharis's group moved at speed, the better to not be trodden underfoot by the disciplined ranks of the Unsullied at which Grey Worm was at their head. Sir Barristan Selmy, his white armor shining bright, was to the north of the army, riding parallel to the city walls. The knight had one eye on his men, making sure that order was maintained, while keeping a watch on the enemy army that stood impassively against them. Within a short space of time the space by the city wall was clear as the Dany's wing of the army marched briskly away towards the east. Across the plain, Dany saw a multitude of flags, heard the horns that ordered movement. Abruptly the entire eastern side of Robb Stark's own forces swung to match the movement of Sir Barristan's host. The Queen spied cavalry and infantry marching at double time to the east, the Solidus quickly becoming a menacing shadow of her own departing force. Ser Jorah Mormont stepped in and called to her, just as Lord Connington predicated Khaleesi. The Starks are ensuring that they won't be flanked. She nodded to mark that she had heard the man. She tore her eyes from the sight of the armies moving against one another. Are you ready here, Ser Jorah? The burly knight smiled thinly. Aye, Khaleesi. The walls are manned and we are ready to repel besiegers. The Gate of the Gods and the Lion's Gate have been strengthened. I can't guarantee we'd hold for long if they send a large force against us. Many of the lads are green as grass, and those that are almost lost their lives to Stannis and have little stomach for a fight. But they'll hold for a while. Long enough to buy time for the Hand to deploy the next phase of his plan. Dany returned to watch the field beyond her walls. Mouthing, almost to herself, let us hope it is enough. Brian too. She rocked in the saddle as her horse plodded forward. Every step taking her closer to the enemy. Though, she reflected, there were less enemies in front of her now than there had been a few moments before. But a few minutes before she had been able to see little of the city walls than the thousands of warriors the Targaryens had assembled against them. Brian could now see the bottoms of the wall and the large gates set into the stonework. She was closest to the Gate of the Gods and she thanked said deities that at least one of the dragons that had seemingly been nesting on top of the gate had now flown away towards the west. As brave as she believed herself to be, she had no desire to face a dragon unless she absolutely had to. The Wolf Guard was on the right of the King's Road, Garland's host was on the left. The two forces kept in step as they advanced inexorably towards the city. Though, if they were observant, the people manning the walls would see that the cavalry forces were headed not quite for the Gate of the Gods but, in fact were aimed just past it on a course that would have them follow the route of the road just past the city. In her head Brian counted out beats. It had been at least 600 since she had been ordered to lead her men forward. She made a quick estimate of the distances, calculating where the best place to carry out her next order. Suddenly she raised a fist. Halt! Her hornblower let out a sound that informed the entire unit of the command. Almost as one the Wolf Guard came to a stop. Brian was proud of the discipline. Having 1,000 mounted men-at-arms come to a quick stop was no easy task. Helps of course that they were expecting it. As indeed, was Garland Tyrell's force. The order to the Wolf Guard seemed to have an opposite effect on the soldiers under the banner of the Twin Roses. As the force to one side of the road came to a halt, the other increased in speed. They continued their own journey as if the pausing by Brian's men was nothing more than an unjustified hesitation that caused nothing but annoyance for the more valiant members of the Reach. Garland's cavalry, all 8,000 of them, carried on past them at a fast pace. Their haste was almost a rebuke, but there were no catcalls, no mockery between the two forces. Instead, both groups seemed utterly focused on what they were doing. Brian watched the knights carry on past her. As soon as they were clear she directed her full attention towards the city. This is where it could all go horribly wrong. Connington 3. It was all so predictable. As the Hand watched closely he felt a distinct feeling of mirth. It was not happiness as such but one more akin to satisfaction. A feeling that he was right in his assessment of the enemy. He recognized it from years as a man of war. A distinct sense of vindication when a plan comes together. John Connington almost smiled brightly. Something he had not done in years. Not since Roriger died. His mouth did not fully form into an expression of joy but it came close to it. Good enough. The Tyrell cavalry was taking the bait. The large host was moving almost straight down the King's Road, ignoring their more timid comrades who had inexplicably come to halt about halfway between the Stark host and the walls of the capital. No matter, the Tyrell force, still on the move, is by far the greater prize. The cavalry had yet to effect a charge but their purpose was obvious. They meant to ride between the city and the company and drive a wedge between the two, cutting them both off from support and relief. Ah, Mace Tyrell, it looks as if your vainglorious nature has been passed off to your son. He has thrown caution to the wind and allowed the desire for victory to override whatever better nature he might otherwise possess. The Hand turned to a messenger, send word to Franklin Flowers. He is to hold position until it looks as if the enemy might effect his full charge. At that he is to withdraw as quickly and head for the south. Connington took one last appraising look, go at once. The ugly youth acting as a messenger smiled through a pock-marked face, with pleasure my lord. He spurred his mouth and galloped off to the southeast. No, not with pleasure, Flowers will detest withdrawing in the face of the enemy, especially when he knows they are of the Reach. But he'll obey my orders all the same. Connington knew that the next few minutes were crucial. Franklin Flowers, an ill-educated brute of a man that was more at home brawling in a tavern or dueling to the death in a fighting pit, but he was a vicious fighter who knew his business. Connington needed a hard man in the east who could fight well but could keep the men in order. Sir Franklin was adept at both. And, provided he keeps to the plan, he should be well rewarded with bringing death to the Tyrells this day. Who knows, he might even have a chance to slay the son of Mace Tyrell himself. The plan, Connington reflected, was a standard entrapment. Flowers' group would look to be fleeing against the oncoming cavalry, retreating south when they would suddenly swing to the west. Mark Mandrake's unit and Brendleburne's warriors, with a portion of Connington's own host, would be waiting with spearmen and, at the right time would swing to the east and north before heading south. The result of this maneuver would be to box the enemy horsemen in, pinning the cavalry between the company's sharp spear points and the high walls of the city. The cavalry's vast numbers would mean nothing as they were squeezed from all sides as the company's spearmen slowly closed in about them. It would be a massacre. Denied the opportunity to charge, the cavalry would be hopelessly trapped, surrounded and slaughtered. The company's men had orders that, should battle begin, and the maneuver to be enacted, they were to leave none alive. A huge portion, almost a fifth of the Stark's fighting men, if Varys was to be believed, would have been killed for no discernible gain. The act would lift the spirits of Aegon's men while plunging the Stark men into despair. Let the young wolf know the peril of fighting trained men who know the business of war. Connington knew that the peril in his plan was that it left the Dornish host and remaining units of the Golden Company open to the remaining Tyrell army in the west. The lines of Reachman stretched along the gentle rise, silent sentinels just waiting for the call to advance on the Hand's men. And advance they surely would, Connington reasoned, when they saw their comrades being rent asunder against the walls of King's Landing. The Hand had to believe that the entire western flank of the Stark army would be called upon to extricate their countrymen. No leader worth a damn would allow so many of his men, much less his good brother, to be slaughtered without at least a token attempt at rescue. With Robb Stark still in the center and his eastern flank yet moving further away from the city, the only recourse was to call upon the men of the Reach. And the only force Connington had to counter such a move was the might of Dorne and the remainder of the company. Well, that, and 1,000 archers hidden behind the lines of Sir Laswell Peake, the commander of the company's infantry in the west. As the Reach advanced, they would be met by volley after volley of missiles. The company's archers, led by Black Ballock, would use their crossbows, their double-curved horn and sinews bows of the east and big yew long bows to hammer any advancing force. Black Ballock himself stood in the middle of his men, supported by 50 Summer Islanders, every one of them equipped with great bows of golden heart. Let us not forget Aegon. If his grace stays in the west, he can rain down fire on the infantry as it advances. Between Dragonfire and the arrows the enemy may get nowhere near our lines. Connington nodded to himself. And, if they do, they will have nothing but a wall of spears and shields to meet them. He gripped the reins of his horse so tightly he felt the knuckles shake under the gauntlet. If all goes well, we'll destroy the entire force of the Reach before the Stark host in the east even knows what happened. Lord John Connington, the Hand of the King, watched with a measure of impatience as the enemy cavalry rode towards his lines. Robb 3. Good, Brian has managed to stop exactly where she was supposed to. His vigil was interrupted by a messenger riding up in front of him. The rider wore the sigil of House Royce, black iron studs on a bronze field, bordered with runes. The man's face was red, his eyes indignant. Your Grace. Sir Andor requests permission to swing back to the west. Or, failing that, to at least halt in his trek across the field. Robb arched an eyebrow, denied. On both counts. The man took a deep breath. He seemed to be looking at a spot just over Robb's head. Your Grace, my master orders me to note, respectfully, that Sir Garland Tyrell and all his force, is likely to be riding into a trap. The king nodded gravely. I am aware. The messenger blinked stupidly. He gulped in air before saying, Your Grace. Robb fought back a feeling of irritation. It was to be expected, of course. The Knights of the Vale had never fought with him before. They had no idea what strategies he might employ or how much he wanted to minimize the loss of life. All Sir Andor could see was that their fellow warriors were being potentially led to their deaths and their king was doing nothing to save them. Truly, life is strange. 2 years ago my biggest task was running Winterfell in father's absence. Now I'm a husband and a father and a king beside. A king leading a host made up of many men from many different regions, heading towards the capital which is currently occupied by a Targaryen king and queen. He almost smiled, despite the situation. If Mother and Margaery's gods exist, they have a strange sense of humor. Robb regarded the messenger. Sir Andor has his instructions. He is to carry them out and trust that we know what we're doing. We, the man asked, the words out of his mouth before he realized what he was saying. His shocked expression reflected that he suddenly realized he had grossly overstepped. The king eyed him dangerously. I know Sir Andor finds the absence of his father, Lord Yone, from the battlefield to be strange and unusual, but, I promise you, your liege lord helped create this plan and goes now to see that that plan comes to fruition. His eyes flashed. I trust that Lord Yone's son and heir will do likewise. The messenger had the good sense to blush and drop his eyes to the floor. But, what of Sir Garland? Robb knew that many of his own northern men who were waiting behind their king must have felt the same as the messenger. They would follow Robb anywhere and trusted him implicitly, but Margaery's brother was a popular man and it would not sit well with the loyal northerners to let Garland and his countrymen walk into a trap without aid. The king looked directly at the messenger but raised his voice so it carried through the ranks. Sir Andor will carry out his orders. Sir Garland will carry out his. He offered a wan smile to the man, hiding his anger at having to explain his orders to a young man he barely recognized. Trust your commanders. Sir Garland knows what he's doing. The Targaryens will not capture the Rose as easily as you, and indeed they, suppose. The man looked uncertain but when Robb turned his head back to watching the cavalry's progress. Taking the king's action as a dismissal, the messenger offered one last bow before directing his horse back the way he had come. Robb let out an angry sigh. Gods, let me have sounded more confident than I feel. The sudden cessation of movement caught his attention. The disciplined ranks of the Unsullied had come to an abrupt halt on the far side of King's Landing. Robb gave a small curse. If the boy had just waited a few moments. He beckoned a rider over. Catch the young rider. Tell him there's been a change in orders. The king's words were cut off by the sudden blowing of multiple horns. Down on the plain the Reach cavalry had sprung forward and entered a wild gallop towards the eastern flank of the Golden Company. Dany fought. Her heart beat wildly as she saw the mounted knights of the Reach thunder towards the western ramparts of the city. Following the course of the King's Road they galloped at a heady pace directly at the Gate of the Gods. And combat. She knew that her initial thoughts were misinformed. Jon Connington has set out, with both Jorah Mormont and Ser Barristan agreeing, that the Stark tactic would be to isolate the city by pushing its army away from it, isolating the component parts of her army rather than with the Targaryens as a whole. They are not attacking the walls but the men outside it. Just as Lord Connington had predicted earlier that day. Why not just hold the city? Dany had asked during the War Council, though she knew the answer before she even spoke. We have too many men, Connington said. We'd be packed in, crowded. And likely to starve in less than a week. Meanwhile the Starks will pick off Victorian and Mossador to the east and south and then establish supply lines from the Reach. They can sit outside our walls eating prettily to their stomachs burst while we starve. That ended that discussion. Ser Jorah was ordering hornblowers to signal the Lion's Gate, the central eastern entrance to the city, to prepare for open fire on the Tyrells as they rode on past. In Dany's mind she pictured the blocks on the map table. How the company would draw the enemy in and then attack them from the flanks and smash them against the city wall. The head ranks of the Reach cavalry went past the Gate of the Gods, the walls of the city making it impossible for her to see. She watched the rest of the vast column carry on past the gate and on, bound for the western land beyond. She pursed her lips. Where, God's willing, they'll be ambushed by the Golden Company. Her head returned to the center of Stark's line, where she could just about make out the Stark banners flying high above their king. I may not have started this, Robb, but, I swear, I will finish it. The Queen scanned the western flank of the Stark army. The remaining forces of the Reach were still formed up, watching the battle silently as if they intended to be nothing more than observers. Good, they can stay there and watch the destruction of their cavalry. Her eyes dropped slightly to the smaller cavalry column that had originally ridden towards the city along with their comrades from the Reach. The banners were not one she recognized, but it seemed to be a wolf sheet on black. More Starks, I suppose. Ser Jorah. Dany called to her trusted retainer. Why has that group stopped? The middle-aged knight stood at attention as he scanned the battlefield. Forgive me, Khaleesi, I don't know. Perhaps they lost their nerve and did not want to follow the Tyrell forces. Why then are they just sitting there? Dany enquired. Why sit in between the city and their own forces like a witless child? Jorah harumphed with dissatisfaction. I am at a loss, Khaleesi. Perhaps they fear returning in cowardice to their master. The man's tone reflected how little he thought of his own suggestion. Robb Stark never struck me as a man who would kill a man merely for failure. She watched the group. Though I suppose cowardice is reviled just as much in the north as it is elsewhere. She was about to reply when the soft creaking of wheels caught her attention. Out of the shadows of the tower came Prince Doran Martell, wheeled by his niece Tyon, the last surviving Sand Snake in King's Landing. Behind them strode Aereo Hotter, clad in his heavy armor and carrying his distinctive long axe. My prince. Dany bowed her head in greeting. I had not expected you to be here. The daughter of Oberyn Martell wheeled her uncle to a distance where he could be heard, though still as far as possible from the dragons who still lay on the stone floor idly passing the time hissing at one another. The prince looked at her resolutely. Warriors of Dawn could soon be dying, where else would I be? Dany offered a sad smile. It was Ser Jorah who spoke next. "It may not be safe for you, Prince Doran, perhaps you should withdraw." The crippled man shook his head stubbornly. "My infirmity prevents me from standing side by side with my men. With my brother." The man's voice caught in his throat. "Do not compound my dishonor by sending me away." Ser Jorah looked sympathetic to the old man's plight, but no less determined. "I simply say this gate may soon be attacked. You risk much by being here." "No more than any others in the King and Queen's service," Doran pointed out, though his eyes had become shrewd. "Though, have no fear, Ser Jorah, you will not be required to expend men to protect me. Tyen and Aerys are all that I require on that score." Dany could tell that Ser Jorah was dissatisfied, giving an incredulous look towards Tyen, who merely smiled demurely back at him. Finally, however, but he gave up the struggle and returned to watching the field. As they watched, horns and signals could be detected from the western side of the Tyrell host. With a heave, the solid infantry blocks, 3 in all, suddenly lifted their shields and began a steady march south towards the Blackwater. Yet, as soon as they took in the coordinated advance, 2 hosts of cavalry materialized behind the 2 sections of infantry to the right and left of the central Tyrell column. Where once there had been 3 large infantry divisions, there were now 5 separately large units with cavalry at the flanks. They fanned out in a menacing fashion and followed their comrades south. We know that the cavalry between the company and the city was all the Reach had to field. Jorah Mormont was taking it all in. Abruptly his body seemed to start as his head shifted from the Reach hosts to the solitary unit in the middle of the field that was just waiting quietly. The knight looked back and forth for a moment as if seeing the array of forces set against them for the first time. He turned on his heel to look at her. His face was white with realization, his jaw almost slack in shock. "Khaleesi, we must send word to the Lord Hand. Immediately." Brian 3. She felt herself gawking as she saw Garland Tyrell's force speed up to a full charge towards the ranks of Golden Company infantry that were arrayed against them. Ahead of the charge, Brian could see the sellswords break and run southwards. Presumably they thought they would be safe if they got to the river. Brian was half surprised by the action of the Sellsword Company. Her discussions with Asher Forrester and Brynden Tully in the margins of Robb Stark's war council had led her to believe that discipline was an important part of their nature. Asher Forrester had gone as far as to say, as the heirs of Bitter Steel, discipline is like mother's milk to the men of the Golden Company. Now they were running, in the face of a single cavalry charge. Yet retreating the infantry most certainly were. The company, their armor flashing in the midday sun like reflected light on river water as they ran away from the column. It was a disorganized, undignified retreat. It was almost enough to doubt the hardiness of the famed Golden Company. She resisted the urge to smile. Almost, but not quite. Brian turned her head to look behind her. As expected, the large hosts of the Tyrell army, led by Lord Randall Tarly, was marching in orderly fashion down towards the Dornish lines. Brian could see the Lord of Hornhill, in his usual battered but functional armor, at the head of his central infantry host. To the south, the Dornish and westmost unit of the Golden Company were preparing to receive the oncoming soldier from the Reach. From her position Brian could vaguely make out a large host of company archers coming forward, their column breaking in 2. One headed to support the Dornish in their preparations, the other to counter Garland's charge. The commander of the Wolf's Guard marveled for a moment. The ability of the Blackfish, Lords Tarly and Royce, even the king himself, to predict how the enemy would react to their actions was as close to magic as anything she had seen. Or at least done by mortal men. Brian's mind briefly flashed on Stannis' shadow plunging his blade into Renly Baratheon's body. She shook her head angrily, clearing the vision of the death of the man she loved. Not now. Not here. A horn sounded, the note shaking her from her revelry. Ahead of her Garland Tyrell's column abruptly turned, veering sharply to the west before straining to complete a rough U-turn. It took a few moments for the column to turn, but, before long, the entire unit was suddenly heading north again, though this time at a much slower speed. Garland had set the pace of his riders so that the horses could rest with the men safely still out of bow range from both the city and the archers of the Golden Company. But not, of course, from the enemy soldiers themselves. Brian sat upright in her saddle. She called to a nearby hornblower, "When I give the signal we advance." The youth nodded enthusiastically at her. She paid him no more mind as she searched the enemy ranks. The Wolf Guard had been placed right here to cover Garland's retreat to the north. This was the moment when they were at their most vulnerable, with their backs facing the enemy. Asher had also said that there were at least 500 mounted knights sworn to the company. It would not do to have them charge unimpeded at Garland as he withdrew. Brian was here, at this very point, to make sure that didn't happen. She watched intently, not even turning her head to the right as more horns from the Reach clamored in the west. Brian didn't have to turn to know that Lord Tarly was speeding his advance towards the enemy lines. The Reach's force to the south was now past the city walls and were making good progress to the north. A last scan confirmed that the Golden Company was not sending its troops to chase Sir Garland as he retreated. Even if they charged now, they would never catch the Queen's brother before Brian and Garth Hightower's force of cavalry at the east of Lord Tarly could intercept. Brian breathed a sigh of relief and allowed her gaze to finally rest on Lord Tarly's host as it marched. A sudden thought made her cast her eyes to the sky above them. Of course, for all our plans, there are still the dragons to worry about. Connington 4. His head went from right to left, a faint trickle of sweat ran down the nape of his neck that had nothing to do with the heat of being in armor. What in seven hells? He had been baffled when suddenly the Tyrell cavalry had slowed a short distance from Franklin Flowers' retreating infantry. As a man who had fought from horseback, Lord John knew well the desire to hack at an enemy's unprotected back. Yet the entire goddamned column resisted the urge and turned back towards their own lines. He had never seen the like. The Lord of Griffin's Roost swung round in his saddle. He called to his squire Watkine, a toady of a man who had been in service to the company since Connington's original employment with the sellswords. Signal to Ballock. Have him fire on the retreating cavalry. A signal was sent but was almost immediately replied to from the archer host. They say they're out of range, Lord. Watkine said shrilly, his expression one of apology and outrage. Fuckers turned back just in time. Lucky bastards. This from Humphrey Stone, a company sergeant and Connington's second within the column. This has nothing to do with luck. Connington fumed as he watched. The ability to turn a cavalry charge into an orderly withdrawal is not one that just anyone could accomplish. But why bother? What was the point of this little exercise? His confusion was met with another klaxon of horns from the Reach forces directly to the northeast of his position. In answer to the call, the infantry seemingly sped up their advance as the rest of the Reach cavalry spread out to either side. Connington's felt the blood drain from his face. We thought we were the ones laying a trap, baiting them when, in fact, the opposite was true. Gods, they mean to hit our west flank with our eastern side out of position. Prince Oberyn and Sir Laswell will have to take the entire brunt of our force. They may not hold, the flank may be turned. And then we'll be the ones slaughtered against the city walls. He grit his teeth. Outmaneuvered and before a single drop of blood is even spilled. Even the fucking archers were divided. Some of Ballock's men were supporting the west whilst others in place to attack a cavalry charge that, it appeared, was not longer going to materialize. Connington could have appreciated the tactics if it were not ruinous to his own plans. He suddenly whirled to face his riders and horn blowers. Prince Oberyn and Sir Laswell are to hold position. Dornish reserve is to be used to plug the gaps as they appear. Have Black Ballock reform his archers and have them turn their entire focus on the western flank. They must hinder the Tyrell infantry. What about the cavalry at their sides? Stone asked, looking grim. Order Oberyn and Peake to leave no gaps in their lines, Connington ordered. I don't want any horses to get through. A rider nodded and galloped away with the message. The Lord Hand turned to another messenger. I need Flowers back in line. Have him and the cavalry with Tristan Rivers head straight down the road. When they hear 3 horns they are to cut west and hit the Tyrell flank. What of the other lot? Stone asked, pointing to the retreating mass of Garland Tyrell's force as they made their way, casual as you please, to the north. Plus those bastards in black just waiting for them. Connington made a decision. It wasn't one he was happy with, but, under the circumstances, he felt he had no choice. My column will advance with Flowers. Together we and Rivers will push the cavalry back and hammer the Tyrell flank. God's willing we'll pin the entire host against the river. But Stark's center is still there. Stone protested, jutting his head to the north. If we call go to the west he'll hit us from behind and fuck us bloody. Connington glowered, not if Mandrake brings his host up to take our place. By the looks of things the Stark boy has but a few thousand troops with him. The rest have gone east and won't be able to move because of Selmy's men. Mandrake can counter the wolf if he comes down here. The group stared at him. Go! Connington roared, enraged at his men's hesitation. We have no time to waste. This is desperate. I need every resource we have brought to bear on the enemy. Speaking of which. He looked to the west, ignoring the riders as they carried his orders to his lieutenants. He addressed a flag bearer, I need a signal sent to King Egon. Daenerys v. Everything seemed to be happening at once. Clearly Mormont's warning had not reached the Golden Company in time or had been ignored. Signals were being sent from the old gate, and Dany imagined that runners had been sent bearing messages, but it was all happening much too slowly for her taste. What she had known was that the cavalry wing attacking the Golden Company's left flank had managed to extricate themselves without engagement. She did not see exactly why Mormont was so animated on this point, but he was. The Knight of Bear Island and been sending multiple messages back towards the west of the city in preparation for an attack. Ser Jorah. Dany called, hating herself at once for interrupting her general's vigil, but she had to know, what is going on? I don't rightly know, Khaleesi Mormont complained, not exactly. The enemy infantry advances to the west and, if Connington followed his original plan, then he'll be unable to immediately offer support. Dany raised herself, practically standing on Drogon's back. The dragon growled angrily at her as her weight shifted on the creature's spine. It was no use. She couldn't see what was happening beyond the Tyrell spearmen marching south in the distance, the sun glittering brightly off their weapons and polished armor. Can we do nothing to assist? Dany asked. I have done all I can, Khaleesi Mormont pointed out. All reserves have been ordered to the western wall so that the Lord Hand doesn't have to be concerned about the enemy rushing the city's defenses. Can we not send reinforcements from the city to assist Lord Connington? Dany asked. You've said that the numbers are not on his side. Mormont shook his head sadly. The numbers are not on our side anywhere on the battlefield. I would dearly love to aid the Hand, but sending the gold cloaks outside the walls is pointless. Few of them have served in an army. They'd be easy pickings for a unit led by someone like Randil Tarly. All we can do is reinforce the western wall from our reserve here and hope for the best. Is that wise? Doran Martell's calm voice filtered up to them from his wheelchair. Sending our reserves now will just weaken this side of the city. The whole attack on the flank could be a feint. What if they attack us here? Jorah Mormont looked pained. I am aware of that, but he gestured out towards the open field. The Stark's eastern force is still arrayed against the Unsullied and our other sellswords. They show signs of moving. Might we send one of those units in the west to aid Lord Connington should the need arise? Dany asked. Her old retainer shook his head more vehemently. No, Khaleesi, weakening the east will just make an attack here more likely. He doesn't know what to do for the best, Dany realized. Somehow, the Starks have taken the initiative. In anticipating the Hand's trap, they've instead set one for us. Dany's head went from side to side. But we still have a weapon they can't counter. Hold here, Ser Jorah, she commanded. Do what you think is necessary. I will aid our brave fighters. The knight looked at her in surprise, but understanding came quickly. He nodded in obedience. Drogon, Dany whispered, her mouth curling as it intoned High Valyrian, fly. The black dragon bunched its legs beneath its large body and then sprung high into the air. Dany felt the euphoric experience of being flown high above the city. She clung to the makeshift saddle and then allowed herself to look down. King's Landing was rushing away from her as they climbed higher and higher into the sky. Dany was relieved to see that Rorgal had taken the hint and was flying just behind their left wing, matching the slightly bigger Drogon beat for beat. At her command, Drogon leveled off and flew straight ahead into an unobstructed sky. Dany glanced down once again. The people, even the city itself, seemed much smaller. The warriors on the battlements looked like ants in a nest rather than mighty soldiers preparing to defend their homes. To the west she could now still the full extent of the maneuvers being carried out both by her army and that loyal to Robb Stark. The forces had not yet met in combat, but both sides were frantic in their activity. The columns of the Reach were marching at speed in a southern direction towards the waiting spearmen of Dawn and the Golden Company. The commander of the enemy, Randil Tali, she remembered from what Jorah had said, seemed to understand the need to push his troops hard to close the gap while the Golden Company were out of position. Even from this height, Dany could see that Lord Connington was well aware of the danger. He had clearly issued orders to his own troops who were scrambling to get into suitable position to fight back against the Tyrell threat. The Queen turned her head to look in the other direction. In contrast to the west, this side of the battlefield was eerily calm. She could see Barristan Selmy's forces a little to the east of King's Landing, lined up in formation, awaiting orders. The commander of her Queen's Guard was even visible, clad in his fine white armor and astride his horse a little distance apart from his men. Opposite them in the field sat the remainder of Robb Stark's forces, thousands strong, appearing as little more than a mirror image, save there seemed to be many more of them. Ignoring the east for a moment, Dany returned to look again at the Golden Company. She saw now why Ser Jorah had seemed so concerned about the cavalry in the center. The small unit that hadn't partaken in the charge south had seen their men safely away from the city walls and had now joined together with the much larger unit. Both were facing southwards, seemingly waiting for an unknown signal. They can charge down the center once more and prevent Lord Connington from aiding his flank. Then Prince Oberyn will be made to fight alone. As brave as the Red Viper is, he has limits. He'll be cut off and killed. As will the Golden Company itself. The thought pushed any doubts away. The real battle is in the west. Sir Barristan's forces must be withdrawn so that they'll available to help the Western Army. At another command, Drogon banked east. After a second's hesitation, Rorigal flew in beside them. Connington v. Gods, let Oberyn Martell's reputation for madness hold true. He had peak will need all they have to hold their position long enough for us to aid them. Connington felt his stomach churn as he waited for his units to reform. The tension mounted with each passing second of inaction. He fought the desire to look behind him. He desperately wanted to know what the progress of his own men was, but he knew that furtive looks would make him appear to be concerned, frightened. Frightened. He was goddamn terrified, not of death but of failure, but he dare not show that to the troops. He just had to wait to be informed that his men were ready. Second after agonizing second went by. Tarlis infantry was getting closer. For the moment the cavalry wings were remaining alongside the marching forces, not getting too far ahead but screening their men from attack as they marched purposefully towards the company's lines. Both Oberyn Martell and Laswell Peake had pulled their men into tight unified column, their shields interlocked, their spears sticking out like a metallic hedgehog. The Dornish reserve had been brought up and was standing behind their ranks, ready to give assistance should they be indeed. As they most certainly will. Black Balak had performed wonders, his archers had sprinted across the fields behind Connington only to form up breathlessly behind Oberyn Martell's shield wall. With their position behind the spearmen's closed ranks the crossbowmen would be useless, though some looked as though they may go into the shallows of the Blackwater to try and take shots at the infantry. Even then, the casualties would not be that high. Connington was well aware that it was up the archers behind the Red Viper that would make the difference. A voice came from behind him, "We're ready, my lord." What kind said between heaving breaths, "Flowers and rivers are marching now. Mandrake is also ready. About time. On my signal." Connington said, raising a hand to make sure he caught the attention of the horn blowers, "Advance." As the Lord Hand's column advanced towards the enemy, Connington took a moment to fully appreciate the army arrayed against them. The soldiers of the Reach advanced as one, disciplined unit, stepping in time with their shields locked together in battle formation. Even the cavalry at the sides of the infantry were ordered, ready for combat. The whole host while advancing steadily, almost creeping forward as if poised, like a coiled spring. The host appeared to be waiting the word from their commander. At which point, Connington predicted, they would deploy fully. Spreading out rapidly like the horns of a bull to envelop all, or at least most, of the Targaryen's western force. Lord Tarly at work. He rode forward, silently hoping his men were keeping pace with his horse's bold stride. Connington knew he had to break the encirclement before it closed. He prayed that the forces just behind and to his left could also sense the danger and knew enough to hurry into position. Even if they did, it would be a close-run thing. The worst part of it was that the east side facing Connington, Flowers and the rest only had to hold the company forces in check while the western flank hit the Dornish. Prince Oberyn may have had picked a good position, and be resolute, but even he could only do so much against such overwhelming odds. An almighty screech sounded from high above him. The Hand, along with a great number of his host, looked up to see a streak of white gold flying through the air above the company. Aegon. The dragon darted overhead, flying gracefully into the arc between the two forces. With an almighty bellow the dragon blew a torrent of flame down at the field, straight at the oncoming ranks of warriors. The fire hit the armored men like a hammer on an anvil. There were cries of terror and pain as the fires battered the metal-clad soldiers, finding its way inside their armor as surely as water found cracks in paving stones. The effect was immediate, though the flames only hit a small portion of the host. The ranks faltered, fear making the soldiers hesitate as they saw their comrades roasted alive, saw them cooked in their armor. Men dropped down to the floor. Those still alive fell backwards, others broke formation to throw themselves on the floor, rolling furiously to douse the flames. Viserion seemed to hover in midair watching the spectacle. Connington could well imagine his former ward's satisfaction at such a successful attack. With one attack Aegon and Viserion have stopped the whole Tyrell advance. Hornblast and yells went up for the enemy ranks. Suddenly a barrage of arrows were let loose from a rear rank of the soldiers. The missiles arced high and then landed in the area where the flying creature had been. But Viserion was no longer there. At the slightest sign of archers training their weapons on his creature, Aegon had directed his dragon to climb. The white gold dragon had darted out of range and then flown high into the clouds to avoid the shots of the Tyrell soldiers. Within moments the only sign that the dragon had been there was the scattered debris of futile bowshot and the still flaming men of the front line of House Tyrell's army. Even the ground near the ranks had been set ablaze, the grass and tundra set alight by Viserion's powerful breath. There was now a small wall of flame between the two forces. A cheer went up from the ranks of the Golden Company. The Hand couldn't blame them, they had seen their foe come up against dragon fire and be found wanting. The Tyrell advance had been stymied by one single attack of the king's powerful pet. Connington watched, sighing briefly in relief. True, he would have been happier if more of the enemy had fallen, but it was undoubtedly a success. His mouth formed a grim line. First blood to King Aegon of House Targaryen. Another set of horn blasts sounded from within the Tyrell ranks. Maybe they'll fall back and reconsider this foolish endeavor. He was to be disappointed. At the horn's signal, teams of men from deep within the Tyrell ranks ran forward carrying barrels and large wineskins between them. At an officer's order the contents was poured on the injured men as well as the burning ground. Instantly the flames were doused by a clear liquid. The fire guttered and died, quenched by vast quantities of water. Bastards came prepared. Connington mused angrily. Though I'd be surprised if they hadn't. They were well aware of the dragons. As soon as they accomplished their task the water teams turned tail and headed back through the lines of soldiers, the warriors standing aside to let them pass. A moment later another signal was heard and the front line reformed, new warriors stepping forward and taking their fallen comrades' place. Once done, the rank pushed forward, resuming their march to the south. His eyes widened as he took in the score of enemies still heading towards them. The front rank stepped over or even on top of their downed comrades and pushed on like an unstoppable tide. Connington fought back his shock that his enemy had shrugged off dragon's fire. They cannot do that all day. They'll only have so much water. Continue the advance. He bellowed at his hornblowers. As his own men stepped forward towards the Tyrell host Connington cast an eye skyward. Another few attacks like that, my boy, would be most welcome. Brienne 4. She had watched with horror as the gold dragon swooped down and bathed the front rank of the central Tyrell column in flame, had seen brave soldiers die in burning agony. The first use of dragons on the fields of Westeros for decades. If not centuries. Gods be good. Still, there was pride and professionalism aplenty in the ranks of Randil Tarlis men. As soon as the initial shock had passed the soldiers had worked to push the dragon back and extinguish the flames the beast had left behind. Brienne had been impressed by the speed and efficiency the men of the Reach had demonstrated. I may not like the man, but it can't be denied, he knows how to command soldiers. The Tyrell host was moving once again. There was almost a sense of urgency to their movements. The host clearly wanted to close the gap between them and their enemy forces. Lord Tarly was well aware that even Aegon Targaryen would be reluctant to unleash his favorite weapon so close to his own men. He would have no choice but to circle round and attack the rear of the columns. Just as King Robb wanted. The Golden Company was still scrambling to prepare for the attackers. Their central host was marching forward, the East Column. The ones that had been attempting to fool Garland Tyrell were now racing to make up the ground they had so willingly surrendered in the face of the enemy. They were not quite quick enough. At double time the central force led by Lord Tarly neared the enemy. A barrage of arrows were loosed from behind the ranks of the Golden Company and Dornish warriors, but the soldiers of the Reach hunkered down and raised their shield, absorbing the stinging blows before resuming their original formation and carrying on undeterred. A few men fell where arrows had penetrated gaps in shield and armor, but the line quickly reformed once again and the downed men were swallowed under the quickly moving host of warriors. Then the central ranks, the one so recently hit by dragon fire, struck deep at the line where the Dornish column linked with that of the Golden Company. There was a sickening thud that could be heard even as far away as she was, as hundreds of armored men struck home to the waiting ranks of Dornish warriors of company sellswords. For long moments the two forces pushed together, neither giving ground as spears and swords clashed. Then the cavalry at the wings of the Tyrell infantry suddenly sprinted into a full gallop, crossing the distance from where they had waited straight at the enemy lines. Brienne held her breath as the cavalry struck deep. Sagarth Hightower, commanding the group closest to her, hammered the westernmost column of the Golden Company. The central column, the group that Brienne suspected was where Lord John Connington commanded, had not yet had time to bring themselves up and around to flank Sagarth, and the young knight was competent enough to strike at an angle. The column of horsemen came from a northeasterly direction, slamming deep into the center of the company's leftmost column just as Lord Tarly forced the other side back with his own massed ranks of infantry. The sellsword's main force surged forward and began to turn to the west in an attempt to entrap Sagarth, but, before the command could be completed, Lord Merryweather's infantry column raced into position to protect their comrade's flank. With another massive crunch the two sides impacted along the battle lines. The sounds of battle reached them as the two groups fought viciously for position like angry brawlers struggling for ground. In the far west, near the bend of the Blackwater, Brienne watched as Sir Leo Blackbar led another cavalry wing in a tight arc, then thundered towards the only part of the Dornish line not fighting. The westernmost force of Dornish, already engaged against a section of the Tyrell host commanded by Humphrey Hightower, was unprepared for the onslaught as they were hit hard by Sir Leo's horsemen. A few sellsword crossbowmen had waded into the shallow water of the Blackwater to try and pick off some of Sir Leo's men. Those that were fortunate managed to get a single bolt loose before they were ridden down by the cavalry outriders, whose long swords cut down and swept the men from their feet in a shower of water and blood. The Dornish line was vulnerable by the water, where war horses could stand taller than grown men. Brienne watched as the furthest column was subjected to the brunt of Sir Leo's cavalry. The spearmen were hit hard and fast, the weight of the horses pushing the shield men back and into their own ranks. Abruptly the shield wall gave at the end. Brienne rejoiced as the cavalry smashed their way through the Dornish line, stabbing and cutting as they went. The line caved in before them and more horsemen flooded through the gap. "We have an opening. Sir Leo will then cut round and attack the rear of the Dornish line." Her satisfaction faltered as an ill feeling came over her. She couldn't say why, but something was very wrong with the picture she was witnessing. True, the Dornish line had been struck deep like a hammer strike to a suit of armor, but the edges of the enemy line seemed to be purposefully giving ground to the cavalry. The shield men were still hunkered down, allowing their large shields to take the brunt of the cut and thrust of the knights that towered over them. Few men were falling as the Dornish withdrew. There was no panic in their actions, more a rugged determination that Brienne, so far away, could not help but notice. Her face paled. "It's a trap." As soon as the thought struck her, a horn was heard from within the Dornish column. At this signal the Dornish shield men pulled their western flank round and reformed into a new, tighter, shield wall. The men were in tight, spears poking through the narrow gaps between each man. At an officer's command then left wall moved forward, cutting into Sir Leo's horsemen. The knights, shocked that their fleeing foe had rallied, could not coordinate themselves as the spearmen stabbed up at them and their mounts. Men fell left and right as the Dornish thrust into them mercilessly, keeping the order of their formation and marching forward slowly. Men from the rear of the column came forward to replace their fellows and, in the not time at all, Sir Leo's entire force, several hundred strong, were trapped between two lines of spearmen stretching east to west and north to south. Additional men surged forward to plug the gap that Sir Leo's charge had fashioned. At another signal these reinforcements formed up into another line of spearmen facing to the north and south, completing the encirclement of the Sir Leo while also preventing any rescue from the other reach captains. Worse still, they have the Blackwater at their backs. Brian's mouth fell open. It was all a feint. The Red Viper had allowed Sir Leo through and had effectively cut him off from any aid. She watched helplessly as the horses milled about uselessly. There was nowhere to run or space enough to mount another charge. The men were penned in, getting on top of one another as they vainly searched for an escape to the ever-tightening trap. Every passing second resulted in more and more of Sir Leo's knights being killed. Either their horses were brought down from under them or they were simply dragged from astride their mounts to be hacked to death below. Men tried desperately to ride into the deeper waters of the Blackwater only to realize that the water was much deeper than they had planned and that the current was faster than they expected. Worse still, not all of the Golden Company's crossbowmen had been killed. The heavy weapons fired at their struggling targets as they thrashed in the river, punching men from their saddles or simply killing their mounts, which proceeded to unhorse their riders. The knights' desperation was palpable. Encased in so much armor, a man that went into the water did not rise again. Brian wanted to rush to their aid, a natural instinct that comrades had when the fellow warriors were in peril. But, the commander reminded herself, she had a duty to perform. Steeling herself, Brian tore her eyes away from the fighting to the southwest and sought out the Wolfguard standard-bearer. "Raise the standard," she commanded, her voice as tough as iron. "Rob 4. The king sat calmly, though his feelings of helplessness started to gnaw at his insides. It's like Ricard's birth all over again. He hated the feelings of helplessness that waiting required. Any warrior or soldier would say the same. But being a commander was, in Rob's opinion, its own particular kind of torture. A soldier has to face each battle knowing he could die, that a mistimed sword thrust, a slow block, a stray arrow, even your horse tumbling on rough ground could mean instant death or disfigurement. But for a commander who led from the front, you faced all those dangers, but also the certain knowledge that the responsibility for each and every one of your men's deaths was on your head. Lord Talis' host was now fully engaged in the west. The king couldn't make out progress from his position, but he could see that the two hosts were now locked in a vicious struggle for that section of the battlefield. The king had seen Egonza's white gold dragon descend on the field and bathe Lord Talis' men in flame. The attack had been sudden and ferocious. And yet not, for all that, unexpected. It looked to the king, even at this distance, that Tali had managed to regain control of his line. The dragon was made to fly off under a barrage of arrows and spears. The fires the creature had started had been put out. Doubtless men had lost their lives, but the Lord of Hornhill had maintained control of his men and restarted the march in a much quicker time than Rob would have believed. Rob hankered for news, confirmation that he was right in his assessment of the enemy's plans, but he was well aware that if Randil Tali needed assistance he would ask for it. His mind flashed back to the gruff soldier who had spent the last few days going through every meticulous detail of their battle plan. There had been no give in the man, no feeling or emotion, just a professional nature he exuded that gave the impression of competence and hardness. His whole demeanor confirming the legend that the man was one of the best at what he did. I would have liked to have had him at Harrenhal. It would have been something to see Randil against Tywin Lannister. A flicker of color caught his eye. There, at the center of Brian's column, a flagpole had been hoisted high in the air. At its top was a large red square of cloth. It was the moment the young wolf had been waiting for. True, he could not see the battlefield as much as he would wish to, he had no idea if Brian was making the right call or not. However, he trusted his Wolfguard commander implicitly. The king did not hesitate. She has earned my trust the hard way, through bonds forged in battle. With one fluid motion he turned to his squires. A group of youth were waiting anxiously for their king to give them commands, their eyes quickly darting from the walls of the city to their sovereign who had turned his attention towards them. "Send the signal down the entire line," he said, looking dead ahead at the city of King's Landing. "It's time." Dany 6. Drogon flew high, the wind roaring in her ears, yet the sounds of battle in the west still reached her. Cries of fighting men, dying men, assailed her ears as Drogon gracefully climbed, flapping his large wings to bypass the city below her. It was distracting, the clamor of battle dampening the feelings of euphoria that usually came naturally with taking flight on the back of her magnificent child. She looked back. Rorgal was still with them, doggedly shadowing his slightly larger clutch mate as he flew around the battlefield. The dark green kept up behind them. He did not seem to notice her look, maintaining an eager watch of the battlefield. Soon, my child, soon. Beneath her she could make out gold cloaks running through the streets, heeding the commands of their captains. Men were running through the streets of King's Landing, heading for the gates in the western wall. Clearly, Ser Jorah had decided to reinforce the city entrances nearest the Golden Company. What surprised her was the absence of the small folk. The people of the city had decided to retreat inside their homes, those that still had homes to flee to wait out the battle. It's for the best. The last thing Ser Jorah needs in conducting the city's defense is the populace getting underfoot. Dany was a little shocked that the people had obeyed the order to return to their homes. She had expected to have to reinforce the command at the point of a spear, despite the order being in the best interest of the people and the defense of the city. Maybe the people have been through too much, multiple attacks, changes of regime and new rulers taking control of the city. Ser Jorah may have been right, the people just want a food in their bellies, a warm home, a few coppers in their purse and to be left to live their lives in peace. Let the highborn fight amongst themselves for the right to rule, what did it matter to them? As Drogon cleared the city, Dany could see her army laid out before her. Nearest to the city was the massed ranks of her Unsullied. Grey Worm in command in the foremost rank. The sellsword companies were spread out to the east with the Windblown and Dothraki furthest away from the city. At the center of this army was Barristan Selmy. Dany was determined to reach him, to order him to move his command closer to the city so that they would be in a position to aid Lord Connington. She knew that the Lord Hand had planned to make a hole in their lines to entice some troops to attack the wall so that they could use the cavalry to encircle the Starks and nullify the effect of their superior numbers, but it was now her opinion that they were past that. Events had moved on. If we don't aid Connington we risk losing the western flank. That will leave us staggeringly vulnerable. So Barristan will just have to head west and leave the Starks here to Drogon and Rorgal. Feeling the power of the animal beneath her, Dany had confidence that her children could detain the Starks long enough for Barristan and Connington to deal with the west while she and Ser Jorah kept the enemy away from the city walls. There is nothing but open fields around here, Robb Stark's army has nowhere to hide from Dragonfire. The massive reverberating sound of multiple horn signals carried over the rush of wind that swirled past her as Drogon flew. She looked left and saw that the eastern Stark line, thousands of warriors had stirred at the signal. Shields were made ready, spears hefted, as the column moved southwards towards the ranks of her own Essozi army. At her command, Drogon banked hard, Rorgal once again following suit. She saw that the young wolf's army was now marching hard to the south, towards her army. They're ignoring the city completely, Dany realized, her heart sinking. Ser Barristan had already ordered her army to make ready to receive the incoming host of infantry and cavalry. She saw at a glance that the Stark infantry was in the west, the nearest units to Robb Stark's own were teeming with spearmen, swordsmen and archers. Stretched to the east, almost opposite the Windblown and Dothraki, were assembled columns of cavalry. Dany suspected that only the Unsullied could hold against a full-on assault by the mounted knights. And they're in the wrong place, in the west. Suddenly another horn blast could be heard and the ranks of cavalry suddenly broke into a charge against Selmy's eastern line. Towards the Storakraus and the Second Sons. Daario. She felt a surge of anger. I have no time to think of him now. She whirled in her saddle making a quick assessment of the situation. It was too late for Selmy to move now. Even as she watched, an order was signaled along the line, ordering the Windblown and Dothraki screamers to head west and to try to flank the incoming heavy cavalry. Even with the flanking attackers the center does not have enough, Dany realized. Ser Barristan is trying to do as much as he can but he simply doesn't have enough men to hold. And with Selmy engaged here, Connington's host's chances would be slim to none. Her lips set into a determined line. Then I shall have to even the odds. She spoke another command to Drogon. Brian V. She saw that her signal had been received and interpreted for what it was. Content, she turned back to her own important task. She looked to the east and saw Garland Tyrell gazing at her with a grim smile on his face. The young lord had ridden his host back to her own unit and then turned his men southwards, ready for another charge. As his men formed up he waved at her. She raised her own hand in recognition. Brian of Tarth, command of the Wolf Guard, turned to her captains. Sirs, let us have at them. A metallic cheer went up as men voiced their confirmation from within their helms. Brian turned to her hornblower. Advance. She used one hand, the one whose arm had a large buckler tied to her forearm, to flick the reins of her horse to urge the beast into a soft trot. Her other hand quickly went to her head and pushed her visor into position. This moment was one that knights tried to postpone as long as possible. True, a helm protected your face and head from damage, but the effect was stifling. It severely restricted your vision and left you blind to what was going on around you. All you could do is staring ahead and push forward. That is all I'm required to do right now, thank the gods. With her visor in place she drew her sword from its place on the saddle and held it tightly in her right hand. The blade shimmered softly in the midday sun as if relishing being released from the confines of its leather sheath. The Wolf Guard raced along the King's Road, headed south towards the Blackwater. They were safely out of bow range, the distance having been marked by Garland during his feint on the company barely half an hour earlier. Their pace increased with Garland's much larger force next to them on the left side of the road. The sounds of over 8,000 mounted warriors made the ground shake slightly as they made towards their destination. By reflex, Brian cast a wary eye to the sky. She had seen the damage and fear caused by Aegon Targaryen's dragon attack and hardly eager to have her own such experience. Unfortunately, she was also acutely aware that her own unit had no chance against the creatures of legend. She had few archers within her ranks and, those she did, were very unlikely to be able to hit a flying creature while they were mounted on horseback. No, the only realistic hope they had was to close with the enemy troops as soon as possible and pray that the Targaryens would not risk burning their own men by attacking with dragon fire. Trusting in the good sense of the blood of the Mad King, what has the world come to? Again the collection of horsemen increased their speed. Ahead of them, down the King's Road, Brian could see the reformed ranks of the Golden Company, the very group that had run from Garland's initial charge. The ranks of spearmen were heading straight towards the Wolf Guard. Brian supposed they meant to flank the Tyrell host that were engaged in the west. The company men had been moving fast, but now, with a secondary force of enemy bearing down on them, they were faltering. Signals were going between the force facing them and the company's central unit that was marching forward, attempting to get around the side of Lord Tarlis' force. Time to stymie those efforts. Now! Brian shouted to her squire. Somehow the boy managed to get his horn to his lips and blow a loud note. As one, the Wolf Guard broke into a full canter, shooting across the field as if some demon was behind them. Each passing second brought them closer and closer to the enemy. Brian could even make out faces, could see a large hulking brute in the center of the company's unit. The armored hulk was bellowing commands to his men, who set their spears into a defensive line. The only recourse open to infantry when 1,000 horsemen charged at them. Another horn sounded to her right, the sound making her head turn so that she could see what was happening to her flank. Garland's force, who until this point had been charging side by side with her own, was now veering away, headed in a diagonal line towards the eastern side of the only company unit not yet engaged. The Tyrell soldiers let out a defiant roar and they hammered at the flank of the enemy. There was an almighty crash as the cavalry hit the company hard, splintering shield and spears as the thousands of Garland's force drove hard into the corner of the sellsword column. She dare not look any more. I have my own task to attend to. They were now close to the sellswords on the King's Road. The hulking figure in the center had drawn a massive greatsword, more a cleaver than a knightly weapon, and was waving it defiantly in the air, the sunlight highlighting the heavy gold bands that adorned his muscled arms. Clegane! Brian screamed before she gave a signal to her own men. Right, you bastards! The hound roared, let's fuck 'em bloody. At a prearranged signal the entire Wolf Guard split in two and sheared off in two directions. They were still headed south, but as two independent units, ignoring the spearmen in the front ranks of the company column and swinging past to strike at the sides. The entire column had been preparing for an attack from the front and, though some had their spears in the ready position, they were unprepared for a dual flank attack at the left and right of their force. Brian struck a man from his feet, her blade easily hacking through his armored helm and cutting the two halves of his head from his body. She never heard him cry out in pain as she angled her horse closer and struck hard at the other enemy around her victim. Her mount reared and she used its hooves to strike men sprawling as the momentum of her charge pushed her headlong into the column's western side. She spun her sword in low arcs, cutting down through swords and shields, causing unimaginable damage as her sword cut through obstacles as easily as a knife makes its way through hot butter. A man suddenly darted in and, before she could stop him, was stabbing up at her side. She swayed in her saddle, the sharp spear point passed a mere fraction from her face, the man withdrew to stab again. Desperately she cut down hard, serving the man's arm at the elbow. His scream was lost in the tumult as he fell backwards into the seething crowd all around them. She swung her sword again to clear some space but the sellswords were clumped all around her. Her sword swept down again and again, cutting through armor as if it was wet parchment. Men fell this way and that but there always seemed to be more. Brian felt her arm start to tire, her breath was coming in ragged gasps. Fuckers. She heard the hound roar somewhere to her side. Brian had no idea where Clegane was but she pitied the man who came up against him. She used her thighs to command her warhorse forward, clearing a slight path through the company with her sword and the hooves of her horse. Men were packed in tight everywhere she looked. Cries of anger and pain filled the air. Gritting her teeth, Brian set to work. Her men were pushing in behind her and she had no choice not to urge her horse on. Dany 7. At her order, Drogon spun and dived through the clouds heading towards the ground with shocking speed. Rorigal was a split second behind. She clung tight as the wind ripped at her cloak and armor, an invisible force that wanted to pluck her from her dragon's back and smash her body on the ground below. Her hands gripped the thick scales of Drogon's back. She hugged her body into the contours of the dragon's spine, desperate not to give the punishing wind any more leverage to achieve its malevolent purpose. It became a battle of strength, and one that she knew that she could not win. My body against the power of nature. Not much of a contest. If it wasn't for the fact that I'm strapped in place I would have fallen to my death long ago. The air was rushing past her at such speed that breathing had become an effort. Every attempt to force air into her lungs was met with only partial success. She was forced to take short gasps of air, the effect caused her to become lightheaded. She had taken her pair of dragons out across the city and back towards the west. She'd made the creatures bank just before the King's Road and then made them fly high, through the clouds and out of sight of the people below. At her command Drogon flew as high as she dared, hoping to be nothing but insignificant specks to the people below. Maybe we'll be dismissed as birds. When they'd reached their apex, so high that the air was scarce and Dany feared she would suffocate, the Queen had forced her children into a steep dive towards the earth. After a few seconds into their descent she risked a glance at her target, the sight greeting her was enough to make her head swoon. Drogon and Rorigal were heading straight towards the ground. The dragons were almost free-falling, allowing nature to take its course and for them to pick up speed the longer they fell. The Stark army was approaching the city, the column growing in size as Dany and her dragons closed the distance. The Queen held her breath and clenched Drogon still harder as they got nearer and nearer with every passing second. If she'd got this plan right she expected her appearance to be a shock. Both Drogon and Rorigal would drop to the west of Robb Stark's host, still near the King's Road but much more to the north than where they'd been previously. All being well, they won't see us coming. If they hadn't anticipated her attack, the Stark host gave no sign. She saw men point towards her dragons and cry out in fear. The column stalled as men looked up at them. The line of troops stalled as they braced themselves for an imminent attack. Too little too late. Drogon and Rorigal opened their wings wide and went into a glide close to the ground and flew like arrows over the heads of the enemy. Dany took a deep breath, Dracarys. At her loud cry, Drogon opened his mouth and breathed a torrent of flame downward at the Stark army. A second later, Rorigal followed suit and there were parallel lines of fire being etched across the landscape. Twin tracks that burned their way through the Stark lines. Men scattered and fled as the lines was completely sundered under the onslaught of dragon fire. Then they were past the infantry and on towards the cavalry. This time, Dany knew, it would be more difficult. Horsemen were faster than slow-moving infantry and the chances of hitting as many men in one go were significantly diminished. Even so, she ordered her dragons to close on the nearest cavalry contingent. As if the knights could hear her thoughts, the horsemen charging south suddenly broke formation and fled in all directions. Clearly the knights, as brave as they might be, had no desire to share the fate of the Cumrids. The queen heard Drogon growl in frustration as his prey cut and run from his fiery embrace. Rorigal likewise appeared confused and angry that the blocks of men seemed to integrate before his eyes. They soared overhead. Dany tried to direct Drogon towards clumps of knights who were gathered together, but Drogon still seemed puzzled and could not seem to determine which foes to strike. Dany pointed out groups, highlighting possibilities for attack, but the black dragon barely seemed to hear her. He snapped his giant jaws and grumbled but made no effort to strike at her foes. Then they were past where the cavalry had been and into the easternmost extent of the battlefield. Damn! Dany urged Drogon round and bade him fly slowly towards the north. She used the time to survey the damage her attack had accomplished. The sight behind her was enough to make her smile in satisfaction. The frustration of the futile attack on the cavalry dissipated as she saw the destruction the dragon's strafing run had wrought. There were now 2 fiery trails blotting the landscape. 2 black trenches that had been scoured straight through the Stark's column. Bodies littered the landscape, their corpses still burning, the flesh cooking within their melting armor. She saw soldiers try to help their colleagues, their efforts cautious and yet frantic. They looked warily in her direction as they tried to guess whether the 2 were prepared for another attack. Dany was less satisfied with the cavalry that had scattered at the approach of Drogon and Rorigal. As she watched, the units seemed to be trying to reform well out of range of the dragon and their deathly fire. Fools, no matter where they run, we can reach them. The queen surveyed the eastern side of the battlefield. The Stark march had completely stalled by the dragon fire. Hundreds lay dead or dying, while her own forces had been bought time to prepare for the attack. Towards the city she could see the white-armored figure of Sir Barristan Selmy issuing orders, trying to assess if the Starks would attempt another march at them and, if so, how long it might take. As it was, Dany wondered if the Starks might decide to call it a day. They had taken heavy casualties already without anything to show for their efforts. It might be that the fight had gone out of them. Unlikely, the young wolf is nothing if not stubborn. The windblown and Dothraki columns rode beneath her, the sellswords and savage warriors yelling loudly in salutation at their queen. She waved benevolently at them as they trotted determinedly eastwards. As she surveyed the field, a glint out of the corner of her eye caught her attention. There, in the east, along the road that ultimately led to Cracklaw Point, was the shimmering effect of an army marching towards them. Victorian. Dany smiled. Her Ironborn captain had made good on his promise to be by her side. He was marching to the city's aid. By Marwyn's estimates he was like to have 7,000 men with him. The entirety of the Iron Fleet, as well as several thousand men from the Crown Lands, good loyal men whose ultimate allegiance was to the Iron Throne and the Targaryen dynasty. Strange, I thought Victorian they would have sailed here. The Ironborn's natural home is on the water, not marching on dusty dirty roads like common soldiers. She resisted the urge to fly towards them. By the looks of it the host was making good time. Once they had arrived they would link with Sir Barristan and, together, they would drive the Starks from the field, from her kingdom, forever. Daenerys Targaryen called to her dragons, which banked into a climb once again. Connington 6. His shield took the impact, the spear point splintering the heavy wood but not fully penetrating through to the other side. He twisted his shield away with a twist of his arm, taking care to cover his face as he struck out with his sword. The blow, the result of a lifetime of combat, was expertly placed, striking the helm of the attacking knight and sending him reeling from his saddle. God's willing, he'll be trampled underfoot. Connington steered his horse backwards, trying to establish a little distance between himself and the front line. As a warrior he wanted to be in the fray along with his men, but, as commander, he had no place risking his life. However, when the Tyrell Knight broke through the company shield wall, Connington had felt obliged to deal with the man himself. Besides, if I'm honest with myself, it feels good to swing a sword once again. No strategizing or thinking beyond the simple desire to stay alive, to defeat the man in front of you. He quickly examined his shield. The spear thrust had punctured the wood, but Connington's riposte had twisted the shield away, allowing the wooden shaft to fall harmlessly away. There was now a mark in the head of the white griffin image that decorated one half of his shield, but there were no obvious signs of damage. Satisfied, Connington returned to the line of men in front of him. He was now in the third line of his column. The only warrior mounted in a sea of infantry that was currently being assailed by a wave of cavalry from the east. The Tyrell Lord had struck hard and fast, sundering the first line before the weight of the ranks behind had been able to snap into place and repel the enemy. Now the two forces were fighting desperately to hold their ground. Occasionally a stray sword or spear would penetrate the company's lines and injure a man enough for a horse to force its way through, but the men behind their fallen comrade would quickly fill the gap, slaying the interloper and plugging the hole in their lines. Connington's unit was now like a human dam, resolved to keep the Tyrell cavalry from sundering its walls. They all knew that, if the knights broke through, the column would disintegrate and be run down like a brace of hares pursued by wolves. They were holding, barely. The Tyrell charge down the King's Road had taken them all by surprise. Connington's column had been in the process of trying to march north before intending to swing to the west and hit Tarlis' host in the flank when the Tyrell boy had charged at them. His banner of a duel rose streaming in the wind as his huge detachment threw themselves towards them. It was only at the last moment, with the Tyrell horse almost upon them, that Connington's men had realized the danger and made themselves ready to receive the charge. It had been a close-run thing, spears and swords only just locking into position as the heavily armored knights slammed into their lines. Connington had feared that his entire right side was about to break. Indeed, their losses had been horrendous, but somehow the line had held. The discipline and experience of the Golden Company showing itself once again, proving that their reputation was well deserved. Would that the same could be said for the rest of his army. All was not well in the west. Randil Tali had deployed a veritable horde of men at arms straight towards the western flank. Prince Oberyn had done well in holding several cavalry charges at bay and inflicted terrible casualties on the enemy, but he was taking losses of his own at a staggering rate. The Dornish reserve 2,000 strong occupying the space between the Red Viper and Sir Laswell Peak had been hit hard by some of the finest soldiers that the Reach could boast. The Dornish warriors had fought valiantly, but they were being pushed back remorselessly. Though the warriors from the south made the enemy pay bitterly for every step of ground they were forced to yield. Sir Laswell was faring no better. He had received an entire column of Tyrell infantry to his left and centre while enduring a cavalry charge on his right. Not only that, but as soon as the Tyrell archers got in range they had sent volley after volley into the rear of Sir Laswell's ranks. Men were so bunched together that they could barely lift their shield as arrows struck them hard. Knowing this could not be allowed to continue uncontested, Connington had sent Sir Mark Mandrake force into the fray to reinforce Laswell. Where the hell is Balak? He's supposed to be providing support. A quick twist of his head to the rear revealed that Black Balak's archers had moved close enough to return fire, but the company archers were ridiculously outnumbered by the number Lord Tali had at his disposal. Each volley from the company was met with almost 10 times the volume of missiles in response. Balak's men were suffering casualties despite being well back from the front line. Things did not look good in the east either. The smaller contingent of cavalry, the one that had stopped halfway between the Young Wolf and City, and now launched a full strike on Franklin Flowers' unit as it marched up the King's Road to support Connington's column. The damned commander had split their unit just before contact and had hit Flowers' men on 2 sides at once. The momentum had been enough for the horsemen to cut deep into Flowers' line and, the Hand suspected, they were close to running. Connington grit his teeth. We simply don't have enough men. The bastards are overwhelming on us every front. If it wasn't for Aegon and his dragon we'd have already been overwhelmed. The Hand gave thanks to the continued attacks from Viserion and his rider. The dragon and struck again and again at the Tyrell lines, belching flame upon the enemy soldiers and slowing their advance. A might roar answered his thoughts as the white gold dragon approached the western side of the battlefield and let forth another barrage of flame onto the Tyrell troops. The devastation was terrible, men were cooked alive as the flames enveloped them. But then, without warning, a veritable storm of arrows flew straight at the dragon. The shafts flew straight and true, striking the dragon's wings and face. With a roar of irritation, and not a little pain, the dragon rose abruptly from the fight and flew away. The creature shook its head angrily as if trying to shake off the small scrapes and cuts inflicted by the missiles. The dragon was flying unevenly and Connington saw that a spear had been thrown from the enemy ranks and was now embedded deep into Viserian's left side. Curses! Egon was yelling at Viserion, trying to bring the creature back under control, but the animal was ignoring his rider's cries. The dragon was clearly in pain and struggling to maintain its altitude. Too damn young. Connington realized in frustration. Too damn small. In the days of the Conqueror, the dragons were so large that they could bring devastation to the battlefield from high above the ground. Here the beast can't get close enough to their foes to unleash its flames without also getting into artillery range from the soldiers it was trying to attack. Every attack Egon launched was met with a volley of arrows and spears. The dragon was getting hurt each time it strayed within range. If only they were a bit older, and larger. Seeing that Egon was out of the fight, at least temporarily, Connington looked about for a messenger. We need to strike back hard against our foes. To his side he saw his squire. Watkine was looking towards the company's front line with apprehension, his sallow face beaded with sweat. Watkine! Connington shouted at the man, anger making his voice sound more threatening than he might have intended. The squire started before making towards him. My lord. Connington took one last glance around the battlefield, committing the disposition of forces to memory before he leaned down from his saddle to speak into the man's ear. He would take no chance that he might be misheard. Send word to Tristan Rivers, his entire force is to head up the King's Road and hit the horsemen trying to envelop Sir Franklin. The sly squire looked at him cautiously. You don't want them to ride around the city side and try and sweep the enemy west into themselves. Connington could have cuffed the man for his impudence. Been a sellsword for so long the little bastard thinks he can tell me the ways of war. No, he said, sucking down his impatience, I want separate word to go to the city. We need some of Mormont's gold cloaks and archers to attack the enemy between Flowers and the city walls. They can come out of either the Lion Gate or the Gates of the Gods. Just make sure they come quickly. We need to squeeze the foe on two sides. Once we've wiped them out we can sweep from east to west and drive these ingrates into the river. Watkine gave a knowing look, but he hurried off to obey his commander's orders. Connington rose up again in his saddle and took in the battlefield once more. To his relief the position was relatively unchanged. Hopefully they would remain so until his plans came into effect. If his orders were followed there was a real chance they could regain the initiative. I just pray we have enough time to do it. Danny 8. There was fire down by the Blackwater. The telltale sign of dragon flame was unmistakable. The western side of Robb Stark's force was being assailed by Egon atop Viserion, whom Danny could see swooping down again and again to unleash its fiery breath on the troops below. I hope Lord Tarly can keep the army there at bay. She spoke a word to Drogon and her mount soared upwards into the sky. She knew that Rorigal would be right behind them once again. The green dragon had been unerring in his desire to shadow his larger clutch mate. She could imagine the terror experienced by her enemy below as her children flew high into the clouds. Such an action could only herald one thing, yet another attack on their host. Though the suspicion that they would be attacked would only add to the anxiety felt by the soldiers. They had no knowledge of where along their lines the attack would take place, nor did they have time to adequately prepare to counter it. Let them wonder, and let the fear totally unman them. Once more they soared high before turning in a tight arc and falling down to the ground below them. Danny had planned their flight trajectory so that they would come down right between their enemies and the city walls. Before they had effectively strafed the enemy from east to west, now she intended to hammer the enemy infantry columns in their center. She hoped to drive the enemy infantry apart and send them scurrying from the field in pain and fear. After that the enemy knights were of little consequence. One could not take a city the size of King's Landing on horseback. Without the infantry the siege would have to be abandoned, at least here at the northern walls. With this side secure, Sir Barristan, and later Victorian Greyjoy could march west and aid Lord Connington. Her own dragons could make safe the wall here with even occasional raids on the Tyrell columns. She smiled grimly. The enemy infantry would break eventually, it was inevitable against dragon flame. Against fire-made flesh there was no answer. Then she would allow Egon the pleasure of pursuing the enemy from the field, harrowing their lines and denying them safe refuge. The dragons plummeted towards the ground. She saw once more soldiers point and cry out in terror as their feared adversary streaked towards the ground. Once again the dragons turned their fall into a graceful glide which allowed them to fly over the field towards the center of Robb Stark's infantry lines. The men were still clumped together, apparently paralyzed with fear. They seemed to have learned nothing from our last attack. But, as she thought this, Dany could see that something was different. The men were not running as she expected, as they had before. Instead they seemed to be bunching yet closer, packing themselves in with their shields set in front of them. Before she had time to register what she saw, she was confronted with a solid wall of wood that stretched from one end of the column to the other. Fools! As if flame cannot get in between the small gaps like water through a cracked glass. Then the glint hit her eyes. She blinked rapidly in irritation. The sunlight had reflected of one of the shields or suits of armor and caught her right in the eye. Dany cursed. Of all the luck, to catch the glare of the one man with either polished armor or a metallic shield. But it was not bad luck. Suddenly, like an archer finding his target, the other shield men angled their own shields and hundreds of reflected beams struck Drogon and his royal rider straight in the face. The effect on Drogon was immediate. The dragon roared in anger as his sight was suddenly robbed from him. The dragon squeezed his eyes shut and banked sharply, away from the blinding pain that the enemy men had blasted his way. His wings beat furiously and now, instead of being a lean target facing the enemy, he was now suspended in midair, beating a slow path backwards away from the pain and flashing blindness. So abruptly did her dragon change direction that Dany had to fight to prevent being thrown. A muscle pulled in her shoulder as she clung tightly to the back of her child. The straps holding her in place strained as her full weight was pulled in a new and different direction, the leather groaning in protest as the strain to keep her in her saddle. Drogon lurched backwards, much like someone being scalded by a boiling pan on a campfire. Somewhere, in a place she couldn't see, she heard Rorigal roar in anger and frustration. Dany knew exactly how he felt. A simple trick. Stark had had his men carry metallic shields, crude things but useful for reflecting sunlight into the eyes of his enemies. Clearly the metallic surfaces had been polished to a fine sheen, the better to turn the sun against her. And into the eyes of my children. She struggled to maintain her hold and calm Drogon while, at the same time, she also tried to still her own raging heart. The sunlight couldn't hurt the dragons. Not really. The sunlight may blind the creatures, maybe daze and confusion, but, with a little respite, they would calm down and Dany could regain control, withdraw them in good order and conceive of a new attack plan. The Starks had no intention of allowing such a respite. The Queen felt something whistle past her head. She forced her eyes open and focused them on the ground below. They were much closer than she had thought they would be. Drogon had not gone nearly as far away as she had estimated. Just a short way away from the ranks of Stark men. Men that were drawing back bows and readying spears. A loud cry went out, several officers bellowing at once. In an instant the sky was full of missiles. Arrow points and spears struck Drogon hard. The dragon cried out in pain and anger but could not protect himself from the multitude of attacks that were stinging his soft underbelly like 100 tiny insects. Her dragon roared loudly, fire escaping his maw to spew into the sky in a vain exclamation of his anger. But then a well-placed arrow stuck the underside of his jaw and nipped the tough skin, cutting off the dragon's cry. Drogon lurched left and right, his wings flapping hard to try and stay upright as he was buffeted from all directions. The arrows and spears did not let up. It was a barrage under which even the mightiest of dragons might have wilted. He can't take this. We have to get out of here. Must escape. She cried out to her child, tried to make her order carry over the shouts of anger from the men below and the dragon's own snorts of pain. For a terrible moment she didn't think the sounds had reached Drogon, so maddened he was with pain and confusion. With an effort the black dragon turned and fled away from the men who had hurt him. The dragon's flight was halting and awkward, but he managed to make it away from the Stark lines. She pointed towards the walls of King's Landing, ordering the creature to land as soon as he was out of range. Drogon's ability to fly was hindered awfully, his movements cumbersome and labored. Dany wondered for a moment if her dragon would be able to achieve her order, found it far more likely that they'd be dashed against the city wall like a glass goblet on stone. But, as always, Drogon did not disappoint her. As they flew over the Storakraus, Daario Naharis's company of sellsword, the mighty dragon gave one beat of his wings. They rose up and over the city wall and landed heavily onto one of the gateways. They had made it as far as the Dragon Gate, the northeastern entrance to the city. The gold cloaks guarding the gate had withdrawn at her approach, nervous at either being trampled by the dragon or simply ripped apart as a result of the dragon's pain-fueled rage. Some fled down the steps to the wall at either side of the gate, others ran into the nearby guardhouse. There were some though who were braver than the rest. A few had stood their ground at the corners of the wall, as far away from the dragon and his mistress as they dared, but still present nonetheless. They were staring wide-eyed at the queen and her injured dragon. Dany gathered her breath, which was coming in short ragged gasps. Her efforts were mirrored by Drogon, whose chest heaved as he sucked in deep, uneven breaths. She leaned down to pat the black dragon's hide. She was gentle in her touch but wanted the dragon to know that his mother was with him. She was about to speak when another mighty roar drowned out her words. Her head snapped up and she twisted in the saddle. Rorgal. The green dragon had not been as lucky as Drogon. Deprived of Dany's control, the green dragon had remained behind on the battlefield to fight their enemies. With a roar, the dragon ducked his head and flew again at the column of men on the ground ahead of him. With eerie calmness, the men used their shields to shine sunlight directly into the dragon's face. As Rorgal recoiled from the column, halting his flight and trying to backtrack, he was hit again by a volley of arrows and spears. Rorgal roared, this time in agony, as he twisted in the air. Dany saw now the green dragon's body. Evidently Rorgal's attempt to attack had been the first of many. The dragon had been blinded multiple times and his body made vulnerable to attack. The dragon's torso was rent with the damage of numerous arrow and spear strikes. Blood flowed freely from multiple small wounds and gathered as it coursed down his belly, collecting like streams in a river before dripping like a stream onto the muddy earth below. Her child was hit again and again. The enemy, sensing weakness, gave the creature no reprieve. Dany wanted to tear the men apart with her bare hands. But she was powerless to intercede, her voice would never carry that far. She shouted again and again from her position atop Drogon, but the green dragon did not give the slightest sign that he had heard. The rumble of the dragon horn sounded from along the wall. Dany's head whipped round to see the old gate. She could just make out the shape of someone standing on the battlements, a thick robe flowing behind his as he sounded the horn again and again. Mokaro. This time Rorgal did respond. He abruptly gave up his attacks and flew towards the city, though every movement seemed to cause the creature pain and misery. His head was locked into position, unnervingly directed towards the old gate, though his body sagged with the obvious effort of maintaining his flight. Dany released the straps that held her in place and she slid from Drogon's back. Ignoring the onlookers, she ran quickly to the edge of the battlements to watch Rorgal's progress. She now watched from the east as the dragon tried to reach safety. Rorgal was beyond exhaustion, his body was covered with wounds. Wounds that ripped and teared as he tried to fly. The dragon was still airborne, but every effort seemed to cause him nothing but further pain. The queen could see his strength failing. Sir Barristan's men were running to the east and west, abandoning their place before the gate. All things being equal, she could not blame them. Even with her faith in her dragon's strength, it did not look as if Rorgal would be able to make the wall as Drogon had. Evidently, Mokaro had the same thought. The ominous dragon horn was sounded again and again as if encouraging the dragon to land. The green dragon ignored the command and flew straight at the gate. With a scream of frustration, Rorgal gave a mighty beat of his wings to attain altitude and land on the gate. For a joyous second Dany thought he'd make it. He didn't. At the last moment, something seemed to give in Rorgal's shoulder. His left wing folded horribly and he dipped dramatically in the air. The dragon could do nothing but let forth an agonized groan as he missed the top of the old gate and smashed into the top section of the wall just one side of the gate. The dragon was so large, so strong that he scrapped along the top of the wall and then fell like a downed bird into the city below, crashing into the street with a gut-wrenching scream as stone masonry fell about him. Dany grasped the crenulations of the dragon gate, tears streaming down her face. She could not believe what she had seen. Rorgal, her child, had fallen from the sky and now lay prone in the city streets. She had real doubts that he would ever rise again. Rob 4. 1, maybe even 2, down. Just one more to go. The green dragon was down and out of the fight. That much was certain. Rob had seen the beast collide with the wall. Even if the wounds inflicted by his troops hadn't caused much damage, the impact of the wall and the city streets should have been sufficient to render the creature inert. And, if not, well, we'll just use the same tactic again. Willer's plan has worked wonders. The son of Mace Tyrell had spent almost all his time since his arrival at the Stark camp writing to Maestas and conferring with, first Grand Maester Lewin and, later, Tyrion Lannister and Asher Forrester, who had had the chance to see the creatures at close quarters. He had quickly set upon the ideas of using sun as a weapon and had issued orders to the camp smiths for metallic, reflective, shields to be produced. The imp had taken a perverse pleasure in scrutinizing Willer's plan and had offered his own intelligent revisions. The two highborn lords had got on famously as they spent the last 2 days hunkered over tables and going over the plans time and time again, especially the shield component of the scheme. The shield pieces had been crude, hastily put together in time for the march on the city. Even with a team of smiths working through the day and night, they had not had as many shields made as they had wanted. "It's not enough," Willers Tyrell observed bluntly. "Not nearly enough," Tyrion agreed in between gulps of wine, "not with the size of the army you have here." He lazily waved at the map setting out the intended disposition of forces. "If you divide the shields equally between every division you can field, you'll never have sufficient numbers to bring to bear against the dragons." Robb had frowned. If it had been Willers alone to voice such a concern, the king might have believed that he was simply trying to deter him from marching on King's Landing again. "But if the imp agrees, have them sent with me," Robb ordered. "My host will be near the city. The Targaryens will want me dead. I'm the obvious target for the dragons to attack." "But what of the western flank?" Willers objected. "They'll be on their own." "Leave that to me," Randyll Tarly had rumbled. The stoic commander looked emotionless at them all. "I'll bring the beasts down with a hurricane of arrows should they dare to try us." Willers had not been mollified, insisting that the water brigades be deployed with Lord Tarly to stand ready to douse any flames that would result from a fire strike on the men of the Reach. From the fire and steam coming up from the west, Robb guessed that plan had been a success as well. Willers is indeed a marvel. At first his mind had been troubled at the sight of the magnificent animals taking to the field. He had been in awe of their speed and power. Feelings, he was certain, that were shared by the men around him. "We're going to try and fight those." The dragons were creatures of legend. Nothing but myths and stories told by old Nan at bedtime when the nights were cold and the fire ominous. To see them in the real world was one thing, to see them fly right at your belching flame was another thing altogether. It had taken all he had not to run in face of the flying demons hurtling towards his army. Any awe he felt had turned to horror as first the western, then the eastern hosts were hit with dragon fire. This feeling was washed away to be replaced with a cold anger and a desire to make the dragons pay for the terrible casualties they were inflicting on his army. He had felt nothing but relief as the black and green dragon had been stopped by the shield trick and sent fleeing back towards the city like a whipped dog. He only hoped that Lord Tarly would be able to manufacture similar success in the west. He had expected Aegon to have been deployed on this side of the battlefield rather than Daenerys to come for him, but, with the Golden Company deployed in the west, the Dragon King had obviously opted to ride his dragon there. Maybe it was simply the lack of the draw. He hoped that his men had done enough damage to ensure the dragons would no longer be an issue in this fight. In any case, it is time to move to the next stage of our plans. Robb signaled his flag bearers and horn blowers. "Order the entire line to advance." He turned to a rider stationed just behind his right shoulder. "And send the signal to Lord Royce." Immediately. He returned to watching the city. "It is high time that Bronze Yone join us." Horn notes erupted from beside Robb. The sounds were instantly echoed further along the line and, as one, the infantry columns nearest the young wolf advanced towards the city. The warriors commanded by Lord Blackwood and Sir Andor Royce fell into step beside Robb's own force and they began to advance on the city. Robb's own column began to swing towards the group of oddly armored warriors drawn up between the Old Gate and the Gates of the Gods. To his left he saw Lenal and Lucas Cobra's cavalry units surge into action and head west towards the sellswords and gold cloaks stationed by the Old Gate. The final game is about to begin, the young wolf thought. Connington 7. This was getting out of hand. The next line of sellswords rushed into position, reinforcing the front rank of warriors as they pushed against the enemy. The infantry column were now shield to shield, fighting desperately for position on the muddy, blood-splattered ground. A group of enemy horsemen, wielding longswords and maces, suddenly caved through the line some 20 men down from Connington's position. They poured other cavalry through the opening and were slashing left and right to clear themselves more room. The hand pointed his sword, seal the gap. Force them back. The spearmen nearest the new opening rushed to obey, stabbing upwards from behind their wide shields, their weapons jabbing at the horsemen. The horses. Connington yelled over the chaos of the battlefield, forget the riders. Take out their mounts. The order was followed. 2 warriors dived in and stuck the leading horse with their spears, while a swordsman opened the horse's throat. Blood hit the man's face and chest like a torrent of water flowing from a wineskin, but the horse dropped dead to the ground. The toppled knight never had a chance. Before he could gather his wits, he was pinned by the boots of the sellswords, who struck down viciously with their sharp weapons. The man died screaming. The other knights saw their leader die bravely, but they pushed on, becoming more frantic in their efforts to force their way deep into the heart of the company's column. But they had lost their momentum and were surrounded and slain, much like the man they had unwisely followed. Within minutes the small number of knights were dead and the shield wall was re-established. They had but a brief respite before a volley of arrows struck all around them. The man alongside Connington's horse took an arrow in the chest, the impact knocking him backwards, despite the heavy breastplate that he had worn for his protection. Connington raised his shield over his head as arrows thudded down all around him. He saw 2 less armored men take injuries and fall back, but, mercifully, he was uninjured, as was his steed that stayed in position despite flying death that landed all around them. When he saw the barrage had ceased, he lowered his shield and roared in defiance at the enemy jostling against his own men. It had all gone wrong. His own unit was totally embedded in their position. There were now assaults on 2 fronts. The left of his column was being hammered by infantry while his right was being enveloped by cavalry. His whole unit was engaged in some way or another. Almost everywhere Connington could see his men were either involved in combat already or preparing themselves to reinforce the line should their comrades fall. To his right, Franklin Flowers had been hit on 2 sides by the Stark cavalry unit. The mounted knights were fighting hard, and slowly but surely they were being beaten from both sides like a sword against an anvil. Flowers was now cut off from Connington's own column, like a limb struck from the body. Connington hoped that, by now, Sir Tristan Rivers would be riding to rescue Sir Franklin with his 500 mounted knights. That should be enough to save the right flank of the company. Once they repel the Stark cavalry assault, then Flowers and Rivers could swing their men west to aid us here. If we can extricate the right flank, we can then swing westwards as well. Connington snarled angrily. I just need 1 unit to achieve success, and then, as surely as winter following autumn, we can regain the initiative. However, as he looked at the situation in the west, Connington was doubtful that anything could be salvaged there at all. The reserve force of Dornish warriors, along with Sir Laswell Peake's men, had been utterly sundered by the massive infantry column commanded by Lord Randil Tarley. The Lord of Hornhill had used weight of numbers to smash through the thinner lines of troops commanded by Sir Laswell and the Dornish, and had successfully pushed the 2 units apart. The Targaryen line was no longer whole. A wedge of troops had been created, and the southbound Tyrell forces were now spreading east and west, dividing the line further apart with each passing second. Connington envisaged the problems Prince Oberyn must have been encountering near the banks of the Blackwater. The Red Vipers' plan to ensnare overzealous cavalry between the river and their spears had been ingenious. Now the river was about to turn from a friend to a foe for the Dornish. The Red Viper now faced attacks to the north and east. Randil Tarley's host had brutally cut off the Dornish from assistance and were beginning to surround the smaller Dornish force against the river. The very trap Prince Oberyn had conceived of for the Tyrells had been reversed on them. The only thing keeping the forces of the Reach back was the continual volleys sent by Black Baloc's men. But even that was beginning to abate. The Golden Company's archers were running out of shafts. A runner had arrived just a few minutes before to say that Balok could only keep his salvos up for a short time longer before his archers would be out of ammunition and useless. They won't be useless, Connington growled. Have them pick up sword and shield and join the rest of the company on the front line. The runner had blanched, but they're archers, my lord, lightly armed and armored. What use would they be against mounted knights? Damn sight more use than sitting there impotently whilst their comrades died in front of them. You have your orders. The Lord Hand had barked angrily, relay the message. He had not watched the man go but returned maintained his vigil on the battle. He looked upwards and prayed for a miracle. We could do with the dragon's assistance right now. Egon's assistance had grown more and more erratic. It did not help that, with the two hosts now locked together, that the young king had found it difficult to find suitable targets. On one occasion he attacked the western side and some of the streams of flame spewing forth from Viserian's mouth had also partially engulfed some Dornish warriors that had got too close. The warriors of Dorne had hollered in anger at their king who had flown away chastened. Since that attack the king had restricted his strikes to the rear of the Tyrell host but even that had been met with mixed results. Every time Viserion flew low to attack the Tyrell force he had been met with a savage volley of missiles that struck the white gold dragon all over. Despite the hit-and-run nature of his attacks there was no denying that every assault resulted in the creature absorbing more and more wounds. Gradually the repeated attacks were taking their toll. The dragon was slowing noticeably, its ability to fly fast rapidly being impeded. And, of course, the slower the dragon was the more strikes the keen archers and spearmen of the Reach were able to achieve against the beast's scaled flesh. The Hand was not sure how many more attacks Viserion could endure before being critically injured. And, without support from the air, we are totally lost. Watkine ran in close to his side. The man was sweaty, his face bloody where a stray arrow had opened his cheek. Sir Franklin sent a message before he was cut off from our host. He wished to inform my lord that he cannot hold the east side without help. The Hand imagined the boorish warrior was far more candid in his assessment than that but he said nothing. I'd like nothing better than to help. Connington felt powerlessness overwhelm him. He tells me as if I had an army to spare and I'd been negligent by not assisting him. The Lord Hand looked at the chaos of fighting men that was taking place between him and Franklin Flowers' unit. He regarded his squire. Tell Sir Franklin to hold his goddamned ground. Tristan Rivers should be with him shortly to reinforce his position. But he is to hold his ground. Watkine looked doubtful. I'll send someone my lord but whoever I send will have a bugger of a job getting through. Flowers is practically surrounded. Tell me something I don't know. Though in some ways that could help. The ring around Flowers is likely to be a thin one and the thinner it is the easier it will be broken when Rivers attacks. Save your breath then Watkine Connington spat in anger, just have a herald signal the city. We need urgent reinforcements sent to us immediately. It will be done my lord the squire saluted, though we did send a message to Mormont a short while ago. I haven't forgotten the Hand clenched a fist, but send the signal again. If we don't there is a very good chance the entire western host will be annihilated. And with us gone, the city will fall. Dany 9. She stooped to examine Drogon's injuries, her eyes glistening again with fresh tears when she saw the damage that the Starks had done to her child. The black dragon's underbelly was studded with arrows. The wood shafts had broken through the creature's scales, some of which had been dislodged by the impact. The queen doubted the arrows were deep enough to cause damage though there were deep rents in the Drogon's hide where the arrows had cut the skin without managing to penetrate further. Blood was flowing freely across the dragon's pitch-black scales. Of more concern were the 3 spear shafts that had embedded themselves deeply into Drogon's torso and the multiple rips in his wings. The dragon was panting in agony and exhaustion. As soon as she had dismounted her pet he had pulled his wings in around him as if withdrawing into himself to keep the outside world away. The queen clasped her head to the dragon's, as if she could somehow share in her child's pain. She was reasonably sure the dragon would recover in time but she was acutely conscious that time was not on their side. Behind her war horns sounded accompanied by the roar of thousands of warriors. She paused for a moment, torn between wanting to tend to Drogon and her need to focus on the battle raging outside the city walls. With one last tender look and an emotionally leaden touch she turned her attention back to the battlefield. She took one haltering step forward, then another, as if every step away from her child hurt her. Dany didn't trust herself to look back. If I do, I am lost. She reached the edge of the battlements and took in the scene that confronted her. The queen had never seen a battlefield in such a way before. True, she had seen many skirmishes and sieges in her time, both when she had lived with the Dothraki and, later, when she had been a liberator of Slavers Bay. This was something different. The Stark host had hit her armies all along the line. Hundreds of warriors had marched double time across the field and impacted her units that had been drawn up by Sabaristan Selmy to repel the enemy. The old knight himself had surrounded himself with several hundred gold cloaks and a few hedge knights in a small column directly in front of the old gate. The unit was fighting hard against a small unit of northern soldiers. Drawn up to the left of the old man were the firm unmoving ranks of the Unsullied, 7,000 strong, under the command of Grey Worm. They were a disciplined column of troops who held their ground even as the Stark host of infantry hit them from both the northeast and west. She could not see properly even though she was straining against the rampart wall, but Dany was aware that Grey Worm would be in the thick of the fighting alongside with his men. The northern men-at-arms were smashing at the Unsullied like rabid wolves, but the disciplined training of the eunuch soldiers allowed them to maintain formation no matter what was thrown at them. The odd man fell here and there, but the ranks merely closed around the fallen and ensured that the enemy was met with nothing but spears and shields. Even with her slightly obstructed view, Dany could see that her best men were holding, the tough fighters showing no sign of breaking. Between the Old Gate and the Dragon Gate the sellsword companies captained by Daario and Brown Ben Plum were arrayed and fighting against the invaders from the north. Dany caught a glimpse of Daario's blue hair amongst the bronze armor as fought with his men to hold their ground against the heavily armed might of some knights that looked like a cross between the tough northerners and the finely armored men of the Reach. Knights of the Vale if I had to guess. Only these particular forces were on foot and made their way across the terrain with an unwavering speed and precision. Much as if they were used to fighting in difficulty terrain against a hardy foe. Lord Connington told me when they cleared the Godswood that there were clansmen from the Vale there, apparently under the employment of Tyrion Lannister. Mormont had later informed her that the mountains of the Vale were teeming with barbarian clansmen who had fought a generations-old conflict with the highborn lords who purported to rule the land. Fights and skirmishes were a commonplace occurrence. That would explain why these heavily armored warriors look experienced in fighting in these kinds of conflicts. The men Dany suspected of being Vale Knights were laying waste to Daario's sellswords who were fighting hard just to hold their ground in the face of such heavily armored soldiers. Archers rained down volley after volley from the city walls, aiming for the rear ranks of knights, but, given enemy had their broad shields up and locked together. Very few of the deadly missiles got through. Brown Ben's second sons were also engaged with another Vale infantry unit. Like Daario, Ben was outnumbered, his men outclassed, with only the constant attacks from the city's archers keeping the attacking army at bay. They need help, Dany concluded. Daario and Ben will be overwhelmed in time, and then the Starks will be at our walls and us with very little ability to fight back. Gods, in time the enemy could simply swing around the city and come in from the riverside, through the ruins of the city wall that had been destroyed during the invasion by Stannis Baratheon. The Lannisters had begun repairs on the defences after that particular battle, and the Targaryens had carried on the work after their coup, but there was still much to be done, and Dany severely doubted that the city garrison would be able to defend the city if it was attacked there. Something pricked at her memory. All my units before the city walls are infantry, where are my mounted men? She turned her eyes to the east, her heart soaring with what she saw. The Vale cavalry on the eastern flank seemed to have been routed and were fleeing away, back towards the north. Evidently the units had never managed to reorder themselves after Dany and Drogon's attack had caused them to scatter. It seemed that Sabaristan, never one to give up an advantage, had ordered his cavalry to make sure that the enemy did not get a chance to reform. The Windblown and Dothraki were chasing the knights away from the city. She could see the tattered prince at the foremost rank of his men, sitting proud as he rode his charger hard in search of targets. He waved a curved sword at the enemy as he led his men at a hurried pace. Next to the prince were the Dothraki. 800 screamers, the terror of Essos, who rode next to the armored sellswords as if they were brothers. She smiled grimly, my son and stars would be proud. There was more. An even greater cause for hope. The force that Dany had spied while flying upon Drogon had made great progress toward the city. They were now less than half a league from the Dragon Gate. Victorian with our reserves from the Crown lands. With him and the Ironborn returned to us, we can crush Robb Stark's eastern army. Then go on to rescue Connington should he and Aegon still need our help. The approaching host had not gone unnoticed by the Windblown either. As she watched, the tattered prince suddenly held up his sword and the men close to him slowed their charge. Horn blasts sounded and the sellsword company decreased their pace to a gentle trot. They watched the Vale Knights go, escaping the clutches of their enemy who had been pursuing them. The prince wants to make sure that the city is safe. Strategy comes before glory. The Dothraki too seemed perplexed by their allies' sudden decision not to pursue their foe. It was, Dany supposed, to be expected. The Dothraki were a warrior people, born and bred to fight and take what they needed. To allow a fleeing enemy to escape would have seemed ridiculous to them. However, their confusion caused them to slow their charge enough that the tattered prince could send a rider to direct them to return to the city. As the sellsword company slowly begun to turn, followed by the Dothraki, Dany felt a small smile creep across her face. The queen turned to an officer of the gold cloaks. The man looked nervous as he stood to attention just behind her, looking anxiously from Drogon to the figure of his queen. "Captain, send a messenger to the old gate. Ser Jorah should still be there. Inform him that Lord Victorian approaches from the east and that he should prepare as many men as he has for a full assault from the wall and through the north wall. We to hit the Starks with everything we have." The man nodded enthusiastically, "At once, your grace." She turned back to the battlefield in satisfaction. It was not over yet. Brian 6. She ducked under the giant's swing. The top of his broadsword missed the top of her head by an inch. "And me having lost my helm." Brian swung her own sword. She had no illusions that she'd hurt the man, she just wanted to buy herself a brief rest. Gods, she was tired. The man battered her sword aside and smashed at her with the mace in his left hand. Brian raised her shield. The impact jarred the shield momentarily. She felt the wood go before it shattered. Wood chips and splinters scattering her hair, face and eyes. She backpedaled, allowing the remainder of her shield to drop from her left hand. She felt oddly naked as the ruined wood fell to the floor. Gritting her teeth, she allowed both her hands to seize her sword grip, taking comfort for the feeling of having the large great sword helm now firmly in front of her. Her opponent was ugly, sinfully so. A bald shambling beast with a big belly and rounded shoulders. His face was hideous, a creased piece of flesh with old scars crisscrossed almost everywhere there was a spare piece of skin. The man's left ear was all but gone, almost as if it had been chewed off, leaving nothing but a hole in the head. But, for his ugliness, it could not be denied that the man could fight. Brian had first been aware that the brute was set on causing her harm when he'd killed her horse right from under her. She had been attempting to wade her way through the column of Golden Company warriors when, suddenly, the man-beast had stepped in and delivered an evil blow to her horse's head. The blow had staved in the animal's skull and dropped the horse before she or her mount had even had time to register the impact. The commander of the Wolf Guard had been thrown from her horse. By the mercy of the gods she had survived the abrupt fall, with nothing but bruises, but not she was dismounted and surrounded by foes. Brian had got up as quickly as she was able, no easy task when ensconced in heavy armor. Her helm was dented and she quickly dispensed with it, letting it fall to the floor without a second thought. Her shield had been strapped to her wrist, and her sword was close by. She had weapons and the will to fight and had done so with abandon. That was until the huge brute had reappeared from amongst the throng and thrown himself towards her. Now she was on the back foot and running out of room. The man seemed to have an obsession with finishing her off, not seemingly content with simply killing her horse. The man's eyes were blood-crazed, fanatical. The sword flashed towards her. Brian parried, readied herself for the second blow. Like day follows night, the mace came overhead to split her head in two. And it would have had she been there. Anticipating the move, Brian threw herself to the right, avoiding the mace blow as her sword scythed through the air and impacted the sellsword's leg. She felt her sword smash into the armed greave, just behind the man's knee, and then carry on through as though the obstruction was not even there. In the space of a heartbeat the hulking man went from a menacing warrior to a wounded beast on the floor. The man bellowed in agony as he looked down at where his right leg used to be. The severed stump was gushing blood that mixed into the churned earth beneath them. Brian's second blow struck the man's head from his shoulders. About fucking time. She didn't have the energy to glower at the voice as the shadow of a mounted man came up by her. "Would it have been too much to ask for your help?" Sandor Clegane gave a small shrug. "Why bother? You look to have that fat bastard well and truly sorted." Brian bit back her retort. "If he's here with me, then that means our two sides of the Wolf Guard have met. The company in this part of the battlefield will soon be in retreat. She soon saw she was right. The hound's arrival heralded the end of the fighting around her. All about her were dead bodies, both friend and foe. She saw the Golden Company flee to the south. They fought hard. Brian noted. The hound snorted. They'd have given up earlier, but the fuckers sent a group of cavalry into the back of us. He suddenly pulled a wineskin from his saddle and took a slug. We soon saw the shit crawlers off. Brian nodded. Casualties. The hound looked about him, his expression one of disinterest. Who the fuck knows? This is my second in command. I must have been mad to appoint him. Well, find out, Clegane. There's still a battle to fight, you know. I couldn't have said it better myself. Brian turned so abruptly she almost pulled a muscle. Standing over her on his magnificent horse was Sir Garland Tyrell. The second son of Mace Tyrell looked down on her with concern. Are you wounded, my lady? Nothing that a good night's sleep wouldn't cure, my lord. Brian said, as she tried to make herself presentable. Garland waved off her efforts. I'm glad to have you say so. I would love nothing better than to let you sleep, but, as you say, there is much to do. She followed the small jut of Garland's head to see that the eastern flank of the Golden Company was now surrounded by cavalry who were hacking and slashing at the tight defense that the sellsword column was trying to hold. Gods be good, Sir Garland's charge was a complete success. We will be with your men in a moment, my lord. Garland Tyrell shook his head, the movement imperceptible from within his helm. No, my lady, you have new orders. A rider was sent to inform me that the king requests your aid in assaulting the old gate. You are to take the Wolf Guard there immediately. Brian did not fight to contain her surprise. Has something gone wrong? We were ordered to swing down to the river and then west behind the company. Fuckers are on the run, Clegane all but shouted over the fighting. We should strike home now. The king is aware of our situation, Garland replied, and I will send a detachment of my own force to take the Wolf Guard's place. As it is, the king needs your help at the northwest corner of the city. The Unsullied are proving to be a hardened group of fighters and the king requires a cavalry charge to break them. Means giving up on a lot of loot. The Hounded noted, his tone heavy with sourness. Brian cringed at the sellsword mentality of her lieutenant. The idea of chasing retreating men down so that could slaughter them and looting their corpses appealed to the Hound's materialistic nature. Garland, though, merely smiled thinly. I dare say that the king will make it worth your while. That is not a consideration, Sir Garland. Brian declared, we will of course obey the king's order. Speak for yourself, Clegane muttered unhappily, though he turned to a soldier near him. Find the commander a horse and ready the lads to ride north. Back the way we've come. The man asked tiredly. I didn't invite comment, you fucking shit. Clegane roared, do as I say or I'll fuck your corpse. As the man rode away to carry out his orders, Brian was startled to hear Garland laugh shallowly, as gentlemanly as ever. Sander. Fuck you. The hound spat as he urged his horse away. Garland's smile did not break. Such a charmer, he murmured, more to himself than to Brian. He turned to speak down to her. I must away, your lady. He bowed his head. Good hunting. With that, he rode away to the west, towards his men. She wiped her gloved hands across her face, trying to clear her vision of dirt, blood and sweat. Asher Forrester rode in close. The youth had blooded armor but looked none the worse for the fighting. He offered her the reins of a spare horse. The hound said, you'd lost your mount. He smiled, very careless of you. She acknowledged the jest with a grateful nod as she pulled herself into the saddle. The rough leather was well worn and looked to have specks of blood across the surface. Now she was close enough, she saw that the horse's coat also had blotches of drying blood mixed into the fur. Well, what did I expect, my men to suddenly found a saddled and ready horse in the middle of a battlefield? Wondering briefly if she had known the previous rider of her new horse, Brian flicked the reins and spurred the horse into a trot north back along the King's Road. Rob 4. Fire. The king watched as another volley left the archers next to him and flew in a tight arc towards the rear of the column of Unsullied. From what he could tell, the volley and little to no effect. He raised a hand to the man standing along from him. Cease fire, Sergeant, he called firmly. Save the arrows. He cast an eye to the King's Road. We could still break through, your grace, the man spoke up, eager to please. Unlikely, The shield wielded by these soldiers are too large and the unit too packed together to afford our men an opening. Why waste the ammunition? He shook his head at the man. We risk hitting our own men every time we open fire, Rob said with annoyance. Have them hold fire on the enemy column until I issue new orders. Your Grace, the man bowed his head, before glancing up at the walls of King's Landing. But what of the city? He followed the man's eyes. By all means, if your archers can hit them, then do so. The man bowed again and addressed his men out earshot of the king's. Rob regarded the struggle ahead of him. Both Sir Andor Royce's and Lord Blackwood's forces had hit the largest rank of Targaryen infantry stationed north of the city. Sir Andor had hit from the north while Titos Blackwood had marched his men at an angle and hit the Esso's men from a northeastern direction. The two Stark-pledged forces had hit the enemy in two places at once. To Rob's astonishment, the unit against the attack. The oddly armored men held their ground, not yielding an inch as the two columns battered them until their backs were against their wall. He had sent orders to the archers to send their missiles high over the front ranks of the spearmen, trying to bring the defensive column down from within. While he was sure that the attacks had claimed 1 or 2 lives, the column still presented the shield wall to the enemy. And stark casualties were mounting. The unsullied spearmen lashed out as their enemy threw themselves against their wall, their long spears cutting deep into the ranks of Rob's men. The wall of protection barely seemed to move, but dozens of the king's men were falling to the defenders' well-placed jabs and thrusts. This is intolerable. He found it incredible that a unit could hold its ground with such tenacity in the face of such overwhelming odds. The men from the Vale and Riverlands attacked time and time again, only to be repelled with each time. And their casualties were mounting. Grey Wind seemed to share Rob's impatience. The wolf was mulling around Rob's stationary horse, only taking his eyes from the blood being shed only a little distance away to share an expectant look with his master. "Calm, boy," Rob heard himself say, though his eyes remained locked on the struggle ahead of him. "Once Brian arrives we can." Movement to the west caught his eyes. Riders, several hundred strong, were riding up the King's Road towards his position. Rob nodded in satisfaction. At last. He beckoned to Squire. "Sound the advance. We're to hit the west flank of the enemy at the same time as Lady Brian. Let her know." The boy nodded. "Yes, Your Grace." Rob drew his sword as horns sounded. "Now let's see what these Essosi have." Connington 8. The body of the soldier hit the ground in front of his horse. The knight who felled him rode through the lines towards the hand. Connington waited till the last second before he lashed out with his own sword, forcing the man to raise his own blade into a defensive posture as the hand reached over and struck the man with his shield. The momentum of the man's horse sent him crashing into the wooden frame and deposited him heavily in the dirt, stunned. He sighed. He turned away as Watkine straddled the fallen knight, pulling his visor back so that he could insert his thin knife through the narrow slit of the man's visor. Over the clamor, Connington did not hear the man die. Would that it were all so easy. His once ordered column of sellswords was now a golden island in a heaving green sea. His men were surrounded on all sides except for the south. There seemed to be no end to the numbers belonging to the Reach. For every man the Golden Company killed, another 2 seemed to take his place. The Sellsword Company had no such reserve. They were being battered left and right by thousands of knights and men at arms. Franklin Flowers' unit had been routed, that much was certain. The reserve force led by Tristan Rivers had arrived as ordered to relieve him, but the Tyrell boy to the east had sent a few hundred knights to drive off the company's only mounted force. The fighting had been fierce, but Rivers had been pushed back relatively quickly. Watkine had reported that he had seen Rivers slain, his body swallowed by the rest of his men. With their leader dead, the company's horsemen floundered, only making it easier for the Stark forces to drive them off. After that, Sir Franklin's unit was surrounded and whittled down with unnerving speed. The Hand dispassionately surveyed the front. His host, once the very picture of disciplined order, had been hopelessly compromised. Randil Tarly had driven a mighty wedge in between the Dornish and the Golden Company, pushing the 2 divisions into the west and east. The last report Connington had received advised that Prince Oberyn's men were trapped by the Blackwater and surrounded on all sides by the enemy. The messenger did not ask for aid. The Dornish were far too proud for that, but he had said that the danger to their force was pressing. What a quaint way of putting it. Connington had sent the messenger away with a few vague platitudes. It wouldn't do to have a lowly soldier see the consternation on his commander's face. There is no way to get to Oberyn Martell. The situation was beyond desperate, so Laswell Peake's force had been pushed east with brutal force. The company's men-at-arms had fought hard to hold their position, but weight of numbers from the Tyrell side had slowly, inexorably, won the struggle, bending Sir Laswell's column like folded steel in a smithy. Those that didn't surrender were surrounded and killed without mercy. Connington was sure he'd had a glimpse of Tormund Peake standing near the unit's standard, ordering men to hold the line. Maybe Laswell is injured, perhaps even dead. He wished he had time to find out. He doubted Tormund was as capable as his brother. Mark Mandrake's unit, brought from the rear to support Connington and Laswell, was now fully involved in the fighting. His unit had divided itself between the two other forces and had provided much-needed reinforcements, while also protecting their rear. Which, with Flowers gone and Tarly through our lines, will now be an even bigger problem for me to deal with. Connington kept glancing at the city gates. He prayed that at any moment the Lion Gate would open and several thousand gold cloaks would march out to their rescue. On their own the city militia would likely be destroyed, but he hoped that the attack would give his men a moment's respite to try and push back. Of course the initial plan was that they were to have marched to support Flowers when Tristan Rivers had charged, and that attack seemed not have materialized. If Connington survived this day he would have the reason why from the gate commander. A shadow flew overhead. He heard muted cries of hope from his men and followed their shouts and gestures. Egon, astride Viserion, had returned to the battlefield once again. However, even at this range, Connington had severe doubts for the creature's health and ability to carry on the fight. Viserion was plainly wounded, his white gold body resembled a target in an archer's training yard. Missiles sprung like splinters from almost every part of his large body. The dragon's wings were torn and blood flowed from the animal's torso like ale from a pierced barrel. Yet, for all that, the dragon still flew. Egon brought the creature low and it opened its gaping maw to inflict another fire attack on the troops below, aiming for the central force commanded by Tarly positioned in between the Dornish and the Golden Company. Men screamed as the fire consumed them. Connington found hope surging in his heart, a newly kindled fire that. Viserion was hit by at least 10 crossbow bolts that caught him in the face and throat, the wicked strikes punching deep into the creature's scaly flesh. The dragon jerked at the impact and veered off. It didn't cry out, but the damage done by the salvo was clearly severe. Egon was gripping the reins tightly to try and reassert control of the dragon. Finally, with a great effort the dragon rider achieved his task, but Viserion's attack had been blunted once again. Connington spared a moment to watch the two fly away to regroup. Too damn young, both of them. His eyes hardened. Once more he surveyed the battle. He ran through the disposition and number of his forces, glanced one last time at the city to check that he was not being precipitous. We cannot stay here. If we do not leave now there'll be nothing left of the company. His mind made up, Connington looked for what kind. His squire was standing close by, the dagger with the fallen knight's blood still dripping from it. The man looked up at him. Bastard's been expecting this order. We will withdraw. Connington ordered, the words heavy in his mouth. The company's rear is to pull into itself with defensive positions on either side. Balak and Mandrake will join us, as will anything left of Peake and Rivers units. Once we form a mass we shall push slowly for the Lion Gate. Maybe if we can get within range of the city's archers we can save some lives and get within the relative safety of the city walls. His squire nodded firmly and issued orders to the last few messengers still available to them. Connington turned to give one last look to the west. He hated to abandon the Dornish, but what else could he do? The forces between them were too strong to fight effectively, and the Hand knew he'd likely lose his entire host cutting his way through to them. No, the Dornish were done for. There was nothing he could do but turn his attention towards saving as many men from the company as he could. It is regrettable, heartbreaking even, but there is nothing for it. This is war. Who knows, once we make our move the Tyrell's focus may turn to us, giving the Dornish a chance to break out of the encirclement and slip away. Brian 7. Her horse smashed through the ranks of armored men, she slashed left and right to clear a hole. Her efforts were rewarded as she cut one man down, opening up a small space in the enemy lines. An instant later she was joined by a group of her men who hammered at the defenders, cutting and thrusting to try and gain purchase, widen the gap in the column, her only objective. She slashed down at the man in front of her. The blow sheared through the man's sword and sliced deep into his body. To her utter shock, Brian realized that the enemy warriors wore quilted tunics rather than armor. Maybe in Essos such clothing was sufficient for protection in warfare, but here, on the battlefield of Westeros, it was woefully inadequate. Brian felt a new sense of appreciation for the men in their odd spike caps and large shields. They had managed to stand toe-to-toe with the footmen of the Riverlands and Vale. It was an impressive feat, and they might have held the line, were it not for the Wolf Guard. Brian's mounted unit had crashed into the western flank of the Unsullied phalanx, using their maneuverability and training to penetrating through the shield wall where it was weakest and forcing their way inside. At the same time, King Robb ordered a new charge of Lord Blackwood's, Sir Anders and his own forces. The infantry hit the north and east whilst Brian men attacked the west. Volley after volley went overhead and impacted the enemy's rear, finally finding targets as the phalanx tried to maintain its integrity despite it being squeezed from almost all sides. Brian slashed down again and again, claiming victim after victim with her spinning blade, which cut through any resistance offered against it. She cut off spearheads, tips of swords and parts of shields before passing on to the poorly protected flesh below. She heard the hound hollering obscenities to her right. She saw Dacy Mormont kill one of their foes by smashing her mace about his head, the strike turning his face into a bloody pulp. Even Asher Forrester and his woman friend had ridden in through the gap to kill the men all around them. A spear jabbed at Brian. Absent her shield, the blow struck her left arm, hitting her heavy armor. The blow didn't penetrate, but the soft limb beneath the arm went instantly numb. The man withdrew his spear and then struck again. For Brian, time slowed as if she observed through deep water. She had no shield, and her sword was in her right hand, held low on the opposite side of her horse's body. The spear point jabbed towards her unprotected face, and then Dacy was there using her shield buckler to direct the lethal point away. A vicious swing with her mace caught the man full on his face, but any cry was cut off as the brutal weapon crushed his neck and chest, leaving nothing left but a ragged corpse to further litter the battlefield. Hissing in pain, Brian pulled back on her reins and let her horse's hooves drive the soldiers positioned ahead of her back amongst their fellows. The doe men in front of her did not fall away as she expected, but instead drove forward to stab at her horse. Brian pulled on the reins once more, retreating as men swarmed towards her. She couldn't ride and fight with only one arm. After a second she simply stopped and raised her sword. I can't get away quick enough. Well, if they want my life, they'll find the price to pay is high indeed. The oddly clothed men attacked, but by then the Hound and Asher had brought more men through the gap and were laying about them in all directions. The men who had been about to attack Brian retreated as the heavy armored knights of the Wolf's Guard smashed through them. The phalanx rippled and then came apart as the side gave in under the constant onslaught of the mounted men. Brian breathed deeply. Thank the gods we attacked on all 3 points at once, otherwise they may yet have held us. As it was, the phalanx was ruptured and, like a building that losing its foundation, the whole structure collapsed under the weight of the attack. Suddenly the violence took on a more frenzied atmosphere as what remained of the Unsullied fought valiantly for their lives. Dany X. She watched from a high tower on the Dragon Gate that offered her the best possible view. In some ways she wished she had never climbed up so high. Never before had events caused her to be so unhappy. The unthinkable had happened. Her dragons, her children, were hurt, perhaps fatally, and now this. The Unsullied had broken, their phalanx had been breached, and the fighting between the Gate of the Gods and the Old Gate had now become a brutal scrum of fighting men. If she hadn't seen it with her own eyes she would not have thought it possible. The highly trained and fanatical force under her command had been beaten. The once ordered, disciplined ranks of her best troops had been overwhelmed by sheer numbers. The remainder were now surrounded and, though they fought back with savage ferocity, it could not be denied that their numbers were falling rapidly. That the men she had pledged to free from bondage were being killed in front of her. All the training in the world can't protect you from a knife in the back. The Queen rushed down the tower steps, and ran across the top of the Dragon Gate towards her child. Drogon looked up at her. Though she doubted others would ascribe human emotions to such creatures, she was certain she saw the pain and tiredness reflected there. Come, Daenerys said in High Valyrian, our friends need us. Slowly, and not without protest, the Black Dragon allowed her to mount his back, hissing with discomfort as she nestled in between the animal's wings. At her command the dragon unfurled his wings and launched himself into the sky. Immediately she felt the uncertainty, the discomfort, that coursed through her mount. Drogon groaned with the effort as they flew quickly around the northeast part of the city. She looked down to see the prone figure of Rurgle who lay, where he had fallen, by one side of the old gate. The green dragon was alone where he had fallen in the street, unconscious and unmoving. Clearly the small folk and even my own men are reluctant to approach him. She looked down urgently. Gods, let him still be alive. Her scrutiny was rewarded by a slight movement from Rurgle's chest. Dany felt her heart hammer in her chest. Gods, he is still breathing. For now at least. She wanted with all her heart to let Drogon land, let him rest and go and comfort Rurgle who had served her well and had been so hideously injured while doing her bidding. But there simply wasn't time. The battle was everything. She ordered Drogon to climb higher in the air. She twisted her head left and right to take in the whole battlefield.